Good afternoon, everybody, for this Inequality Today crash workshop that we are holding this afternoon at Scuola Normale Superiore in Florence, with an amazing group of researchers and scholars from different universities in Italy, plus a very esteemed guest from abroad. We'll have two sessions with a short break. I will invite everybody to be on time with the presentation so that we can enjoy this opportunity also for some discussion. I am Guglielmo Meardi. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Political and Social Sciences here at Scuola Normale Superiore, where one of the areas where we conduct research, doctoral research, and a number of research projects is exactly around inequality, especially with the leadership of Mario Pianta, who is the director of the Istituto di Studi Avanzati, Carlo, Azeglio, Ciampi, which is hosted also in this faculty. Now, to start, we will have a presentation from James Galbraith, Professor of Government at the University of Texas at Austin. Is one of the best-known economists around the world on the area of inequality. He has published extensively, won a number of prizes. I cannot make the list without running over time with the program. But let me mention that he is also our guest now as a Ciampi visiting scholar, and he will deliver on Friday morning at 11 to 11 o'clock in the same room where we are now, a Ciampi lecture to which everybody is invited. The title for today from James is Changing Inequality as a Global Macroeconomic Phenomenon. Thank you, James, for being with us, and the floor is yours.
There. Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. The work I'm going to summarize for you today is not new work. It is rather the culmination of a project which has been underway for practically 3 decades and carried out for the most part by echelons of PhD students who have been working with me. This has started at a time when work on inequality was not yet as fashionable as it has since become. But it was our advantage to be able to undertake this work at a time when there were many different channels of opportunities to pursue. What we found when we began here was that essentially the data that were available for assessing inequality in a comparative sense, either across countries or through time, was substantially inadequate for any serious purpose. The principal data set was initially presented by World Bank researchers in the middle 1990s. And just to give you an idea of what it looked like, you can see for selection of countries that these are a compilation of survey data using the familiar Gini coefficient, that there are many gaps in the data, and that trends, if they exist, are far from apparent. So this is extremely difficult to work with. Dininger and Squire, let's see, I guess I didn't show a slide, but they tried to improve the data set by essentially limiting it to high quality numbers, which only increased the sparsity of the, wait a minute, whoops, there we are. Sorry, there it is. The sparsity of the available numbers. You can really see that it's very hard to to try and compare across countries or to assess what was going on through time. Oh, that's not working. Terribly sorry. So I'll just say what we did differently. What we did differently was to mine administrative data sets that would give us insight into the movement of inequality if there happened to be a systematic relationship between those data sets, what was in those data sets, and the movement of inequality in some larger sense that one might be interested in. The data sets that were available to us were of many different types, but the ones that proved to be most useful were industrial data sets that showed very simply the employment and payroll across industrial sectors collected in a systematic way and repetitively by national and international agencies over time. And ultimately we settled on, well, we used a great many of them, but the one that turned out to be most useful was the industrial statistics of the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, which had very wide coverage and substantial coverage in time. From this, we were able to calculate first of all, a measure of inequality that was strictly related to those data sets, which was calculated using what is called the Tiles T statistic across groups. A very simple calculation involving simply the average income of the group and its weight in the whole population. We were then able to match that measure to pre-existing survey-based data sets, in this case, Diener and Squire, and you can see from this particular regression result that, particularly the blue line, that the highlighted line, that our measure of inequality is very closely related to theirs. Once you control for the type of survey-based measure that they were using, whether it was gross or net of income, whether it was personal or household, whether it was one other category, income or consumption-based measures, all of which affected the level of the survey-based inequality measures. So once we had that relationship, and one other variable, which was the one below LN final, which is the ratio of manufacturing employment to population, that's to say the amount of manufacturing in the economy, we had two coefficients that we could use to develop an extremely simple model for estimating the level of household income inequality on a gross income basis for a very wide range of countries over a very long period of time, because we had the basic data required for that purpose. And so we ended up in the most recent configuration of this data set with about 4,000 country year estimates for 154 countries over the time period 1963 to 2014. And that is, I think, the largest single data set based upon a single consistent measure of inequality or estimate of household income inequality that exists, that does not use imputations between years or across countries. The only imputations that we used were occasionally inside the industrial data set. You might have a year that was missing, let's say, the employment number for the automobile industry. And you could say, well, okay, it's the average of the two surrounding years. That kind of imputation we allowed for, but fundamentally, our measure only uses numbers that are independently collected for a given country in a given year. And from that, using these two regression coefficients, the beta hats from that regression, we were able to estimate the household income inequality for that country in that year, which tells you something, it seems, about what is driving household income inequality. Now, this is essentially being driven by two factors in most countries, not everywhere, but in most countries, by the degree of industrialization, let's say the size of the industrial working class, and the degree of inequality within the industrial sector. These things are the driving forces, so far as we can tell. Okay. We have made comparisons with our data set with other very prominently used and widely available data sets, the Luxembourg Income Study, the World Bank Development Income Indicators, the EU's SILC, and others. And we find that, and you can look this up on our data set, that we have very much deeper, a more extensive coverage of the numbers that were substantially consistent with these data sets. We're not at all consistent with, oh, okay, here's some specifics that I will not trouble to go into in detail. But you can see that, for example, total observations, we have 4,550. The World Development Indicators, it's about 4 times the level of the World Development Indicators, and an order of magnitude more than the Luxembourg Income Studies or the SILC in terms of what is covered. Okay. I'll show you what our numbers look like, and you can project them on a map, and they give you a very simple picture. This is for the 1960s, a world in which there were relatively low-income inequality countries amongst the industrialized countries of Europe, North America, Australasia, and high inequality countries in the emerging countries of the recently decolonized Africa and South Asia. As time went on, 70s, 80s, the 1990s, and we fill out the data set as time goes on, as you get to, you can see that the picture changes substantially, and that most of the world, with the exception of a very small number of countries in Northern Europe, are substantially more unequal than they were in the 1960s. And in fact, the overall inequality of the world economy is comparable and similar to what it was in the so-called developing world in the early post-colonial period, 1960s. So this is the story that the data tell, and to some degree, I think you can take some reassurance that it's consistent insofar as countries which are closely contiguous to each other or in similar positions in the world economy tend to have quite similar inequality measures, which is more or less what you would expect in an integrated world economy. Okay, I'll go back. There's the 60s, there's thousands, and so you can see how the data evolve in our measures. But that does not establish that the data are correct. The only way to do that we could really assess was to go through the literature and compare our measures to everything else that we could find that was out there. So if you, this was done by some very, let's say, diligent and meticulous students of mine who had multiple language skills. Just go through the journals and pick out the measures of inequality and then try to classify them according to what kind of measures they were. And this is Canada. And you can see, I'll say first of all that the black line is our measure, which of course gives you a sense. Our measure is a measure which intends to capture gross household income inequality, and that is to say it is gross of tax but net of transfers, okay? The green measures are so-called market income inequality, much more unequal, especially in developed countries, and for a reason that I think is not generally speaking recognized, which is that there are a lot of households in advanced countries that have zero market income because all of their income comes from public sources, pensions, for example. And though that will drive up the inequality measure across household for market income, it's an artifact of wealth, not of inequality. That's an important point because a lot of people use market inequality to show how unequal places are. It's not a correct interpretation. The red measures are disposable income inequality, so they're typically much lower in countries which have progressive tax systems. The blue measures are close to ours. They're gross income inequality. So what we're hoping for is that our lines will line up with the blue measures, which they do, for example, here's Denmark. There's Germany very closely. The dotted line at the bottom is the Deutsche Demokratische Republik until its end in 1909. There's Spain. There's the United Kingdom. And I'll go through a number of others, but I guess I've abbreviated the list here. For transition economies, you do not have the big distinction between gross and net income inequality because they didn't have distributive tax systems. They had simply low inequality wage systems. Our measures track them very well. In Poland, you can see the chaos in Russia in the 1990s, the chaos in Ukraine in the early And for the developing world, so-called, a measure, generally speaking, works pretty well. In India, for example, we're quite high compared to the measure, but the measure that's generally used is a consumption-based measure, not an income measure. There's only one point here, which is a Luxembourg income study measure that is of an income measure, and that is very close to ours. There's Côte d'Ivoire and Egypt and a number. South Africa is an example, and it should be clear that we're not consistent with survey data in every single case. South Africa, we're considerably lower. South Africa is a country where 30% of survey respondents say they have zero household income, and that will give you 30 extra points on a Gini coefficient of complete equality for all the other and all of the purposes. Of course, it's not the case. The other thing about South Africa that's interesting is that there are no surveys that transcend the period of the liberation from the apartheid regime. And part of what's going on there is an increasing number of people are counted as South African citizens who were previously counted as the citizens of the so-called homelands. So anyway, I will quickly move on to what we can extract from this as a general proposition. Is once you have a reasonably good panel that you believe to be reasonably reliable for the movement of inequality across a whole set of countries, you can ask the question, is there a commonality in the movement? Right? And that's a question which you can answer with a two-way fixed effects regression analysis. The time coefficients of that analysis are portrayed on this diagram. And you can see very clearly, without any further ado, that a major change occurs around 1980. That in the 1970s, these numbers are stable or declining to a substantial extent. After 1980, for about 20 years, they're increasing very rapidly. Well, it is not, I think, it doesn't require an enormous amount of knowledge of what was going on in the world economy to understand that with the arrival of Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom, Ronald Reagan in the United States, and I regret to say François Mitterrand in France, but also of the change in the global financial regime initiated by Paul Volcker in 1981, that the world was thrown into a series of crises which have a reflection in the inequality measures that we were able to extract from the data. This is why I said this is about global finance and global inequality. So if you look at what's going on here, the debt crisis that erupts, first of all, there's a commodities and debt boom in the 1970s, which is associated substantially with strong growth and reduced inequality, major turnaround after 1980, the fall of the USSR at the end of the 1980s, early 1990s, the Asian crisis in the mid-1990s, right up until essentially to the peak of the information technology boom in the United States and the 9/11 attacks and the reduction of interest rates in 2000, after which, for a period of time, the numbers stabilize at a high level, with a peak at the time of the great financial crisis in 2008, which does not appear to have had, so far anyways, substantial long-term effects on the world numbers. So that's the basic story, and what it tells us is that that the movement of inequality across many countries in the world economy, so far as we're able to measure it, seems to be closely associated with the major developments in the global macroeconomic, monetary, and financial regime. And that's not entirely surprising. When countries are thrown into debt crises, their currencies collapse, and when their currencies collapse, their inequality goes up. And we are moving along to assess the relationship between, this is the original first stage industrial inequality number and exchange rate values for a whole range of countries. And what you can see that for rich countries, poor countries, big countries, small countries, close to the United States, far from the United States, deep in Europe, not in Europe, again, very close to Mexico, God help them, very close to the United States. The relationship between the inequality, industrial inequality measures and the exchange rate is positive and close in almost every case. Well, what's going on here? I would suggest, there's some exceptions, but what I would suggest is that this is a very simple story. If you are in a country which is in a trading relationship with the advanced countries of the world, in particular with the United States, you have two sources of income in that country. You can earn your income inside the country, or you can earn it by selling to the external markets of the rich countries. If you're in Mexico, you're selling auto parts, glass, sulfur, maybe agricultural goods, but mostly these industrial components to the United States. Or you are selling food and supplies and so forth in the domestic economy. If you're selling in the domestic economy, your income's in pesos. If you're selling it to the United States, your income in the first instance is in dollars. If the Mexican peso depreciates, the number of pesos goes up for the exporters who are already at the top of the income distribution in the country. So the inequality number is going to go up. And that is a very powerful driving force, which gives essentially global finance and its capacity to manipulate exchange rates a very strong direct influence over the inequality inside countries that are essentially part of the global periphery, which is most countries. It's a very simple story. It does not require, there's no J-curve effect here. There does not require any adjustment in volumes. The next day after a collapse of let's say, the Mexican peso, the exporters are earning more pesos and the taxi drivers are not earning more pesos. And the exporters are earning more, were earning more to begin with than the taxi drivers. And that drives the inequality up. It happens, it's not a delayed effect. It's an accounting consequence of the valuation of exports in the Mexican economy, or any other economy that you care to talk about. And it's a very systematic. That will be eventually the capstone paper from this project that we're going to try and finish up this summer. If you're interested in further aspects of this research, there are lots of comparisons with other data sets, and including some rather critical comparisons with the use of tax records for a similar purpose. And the problem with tax records is that tax laws change, and tax laws are not similar from one country to the next. So what is the top 1% in let's say, India, and what is the top 1% in let's say, Germany, are two very, very different propositions. And I'll give credit to various students in the most recent iteration of this project, and you can look up the work. There are about 78 working papers now on the website. Jahi is the one. Jahi Choya and I are still working together, and the others. Beatrice is from France, Alexander is from Poland, Delphina is from Argentina, Amin is from Iran, Wenjia is from China. So it's been a very gratifyingly multinational project over the years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jim, for this global overview plus national insights in 20 minutes. That's been extremely interesting. I would like to now invite the next speaker. I don't know whether, James, you want to sit on this side or on that side. Probably you see the screen better. As you're free, feel free. And the next one is Maurizio Franzini, who is a full professor of economic policy at Sapienza University in Rome, and will speak about top managers and superstars. Why do they earn so much?
I don't know.
The Cristiano Ronaldo factor.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I have some thoughts on this question and their possible answers. So I'm still in the preliminary stage of developing this research. And what is it? This one? Ok, adesso la direzione giusta. La tastiera. Corto. Okay. So I start from reminding you that the problem of what I call non-capital income, because I'm not sure how to call the earnings of superstars and CEO. I call it non-capital income. And it seems that the share of income coming from these sources in the top 1% of income has increased a lot in the last few years and is quite high in many countries. So we have a lot of the highest income seems to come from non-capital sources, not as a return on wealth or on capital. In particular, we have in Italy, according to the estimates by Demetrio and Guzzardi and Salvatore Morelli, more than 75% of the total income of the top 1% does not come from capital, and that's this origin in some sense. Moreover, remember that top 1% explains a larger share of the total income, so there's a concentration at the top. So this allows us to believe that changes in the last few years have been enormous. In the United States, of course, the situation is the same, even in some sense more pronounced. But what I want to try to do is to understand this phenomenon, giving you some hint at specific compensation, which are incredible. I don't go very much into this data, but as you can have a look at this, really enormous. With a huge difference, if we talk about CEOs, with a huge difference between the United States and other countries. The CEOs in the United States earn 5 or 10 times more than CEOs in Europe or in other countries. In China, also, CEOs of the state-owned enterprises are increasing a lot. So this phenomenon is not typical of market economies. It has to do with something more. Now, one aspect which I want to stress, because on this I will try to base my explanation, is that what has happened is that the share of, better, the earnings of the CEO and superstar with respect to the share, with respect to the earnings of workers has increased a lot. Today is about, in the United States, 344 times. What matters to me is also that this compensation have grown more than stock market and dividends. So it is like having a distribution of the extra value added, how you call, coming from growth, enormously biased towards the CEO. That's important. Let us start from this sport and entertainment superstar. Here you can have some information about who they are and how much they earn. There are differences between sports, but you see the richest has been Cristiano Ronaldo with 136 million in 2022, seems to me. But what matters is that a large part of this does not come from compensation for his performance as a football player. 90 million out of 136 for him come from endorsement, let us call endorsement activities, which means advertising and related issues. This is important too. I will come back to this. In general, also the CEO earn a lot of money, not from fixed compensation. It comes from bonuses, from stock options. Today, stock options are being substituted by stock award, just because they want to be sure that when they get something more, it's because they have achieved something. Stock options was too in favor and a bit asymmetric with respect to risk. Anyway, there's a lot which is not fixed. It depends on, and my point is that this income is due to as the purpose, as the goal of making the objectives of the manager, of the CEO, aligned with the managers of the shareholders. So it solves it's intended to solve a kind of principal agent problem. So if you want to give a name to this income, I suggest to use it as income from the alignment to capitalist objectives. And it's a kind of rent, okay? Something that in a perfectly competitive market or in a competitive market would not exist, comes out from other. And this also tells us that we have to think more about who the managers are, if you need this kind of income for having them to perform in the interests of the shareholders. And the same for the superstars. We can say that superstars and a lot of money coming from what I call celebrity income. In other words, the reason why they obtain all that money is because they are notorious. Not because they are very good at doing what is their profession. What are the explanations that we have so far for these two phenomena? Mainly two. Talent. All these people is endowed with a lot of talent. Or power. Two very imprecise concepts, I would say. Both of them are not very precise concepts. And not convincing to me, unless you specify it better. In particular, you'd have to specify better what you mean by power in the case of the managers. Talent is not convincing because if talent is the only reason why there's been this explosion in the earnings, you should have people, for instance, I give you the example of Pelé and Cristiano Ronaldo. I don't think that Cristiano Ronaldo is 5 more talented or 6 more talented than Pelé. So what I suggest is to look at not personal attributes, but structural elements, to go into the analysis of the working of the context in which this actor played their part. Context in the change in the context can explain, I think, these big changes. And here is an example of CEO with no motivation in terms of talent and getting a lot of money. For instance, that's interesting to note that in the UK, 3 or 4 of the best paid CEO were working in the oil and gas companies or in the arms company. So, which is the talent for working in that and getting all that money? So it's a matter of other things, of course. And when Trump cut the taxes, this allowed many managers, many CEOs to get earlier, and to a larger extent, the objectives they had. So that means that they earned a lot more as bonuses. No talent, I think, in this case, too. Where they are is important, much more than. So what could be an explanation for the superstars? Where do I look at? I look at, I put it briefly, at changes in technology that have made it possible to sell, so to say, the same performance to a much, much wider audience. Kruger, several years ago, put forward this point, which is important. Changing the technology of microphones has made it possible to hear the concert, I'm talking about the concert, in a good way, even if you are in the extreme corner of a big stadium, which was not possible 20 years ago. So I can imagine a situation like this. People was rationed in their access previously, in their access to the concert, because no more than that people in the hall. Now technology is a kind of mechanism which overcomes that rationing. That same people, which beforehand was rationed, and you could achieve them, you could reach them giving more concerts. Now with the same concert, you obtain a lot of audience. And this is important. Even, of course, if it is a ticket, earnings increase a lot. And from a production function point of view, it is like having more production without more inputs, which means more revenues without cost, which means zero marginal cost, which means that this technology, which is technology of joint consumption, in other words, more people can enjoy the same performance, is also technology which allows to have zero marginal cost, or almost zero marginal cost. I think that this is an important point, and what strikes me is also that making large audiences allows us also to do something which is, I think, underestimated by all the economists, to make advertising a source of inequality. So in other words, people can earn a lot of money through the advertising in its various forms. And generally, when we talk of the relationship between advertising and inequality, we think of what happens to the consumers, what happens to people being influenced by the... But we don't think at the impact of advertising on those who make the advertising, on those who earn a lot of money reaching. This is, I think, something to give more weight to. One point, yes, one point to stress is this one. Zero marginal cost. When people started talking about zero marginal cost, the first thing they said is this is the end of capitalism. Why? Because zero marginal cost, assuming competition, means zero prices. If it means zero prices, you can't have markets, you can't have capitalism. Rifkin wrote a beautiful book on this, but the story has gone the opposite direction, and we should have an explanation for that. I have an hypothesis, but there is no time to tell. Next time. What about the CEO? So, superstars look at technology and joint consumption and zero marginal cost. CEO, well, CEO, I start from this consideration. We have seen that when, they are able to capture a greater share of value added when value added increases. I'm speaking in a very approximate way. So my idea is that the power of the manager is not they overwhelm the shareholders, but that in a context of growth of the firm, it is much easier to move part of the value added in their favor. Shareholders are happy because they get more. Okay? Workers could themselves get more, but the share are less than before. So there's a change in inequality when you combine those two things, the growth and the power, which is the power of obtaining more of the excess, of the extra product, because the reactions are weakened by that. And I don't want to exaggerate, but if you know, there is a relationship between the rate of growth of the economy as a whole and the share going to the top, 10% or 5%. Maybe this could help us to understand what happens, okay? So finally, and there is much more to say, the power is related to the growth. So the conclusion is the last few lines are that there are some features of modern capitalism which are extremely important to me to understand important new features of inequality, which is concentration at the top, subjects who gets a lot of money, who earns a lot of money, and these three features are zero marginal cost in many contexts, the role advertising, and the CEO as a kind of independent and autonomous actor whose importance and even power is growing as a sort of class in itself. I don't know whether I can use this word, but they seems to me something which cannot be reconducted to workers and cannot be reconducted to typical shareholders. And their power depends very much on the ability to get more when the firm gets larger. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Fascinating. We'll get back to this certainly with the discussion. And the next speaker I invite here, well, actually, it's John Tact, isn't it? Or only Only one. Okay. Luca Giangregorio, assegnista, postdoc researcher at Roma University in Rome, together with Davide Villani, researcher at the Joint Research Center in Seville. And the title is Income Inequality, Top Shares of Income and Social Classes, something for sociologists as well. I'm very happy.
We hope so. Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. Probably this work is going to link nicely with what has been discussed already today. This is the work I written together with Luca Giangregorio, and basically, what we did first were some reflection on the concept of functional income distribution. As you all know, functional income distribution was at the core of classical political economies. There was a correspondence between sources of income, class interest, and class location. Workers receiving wages, capitalists receiving rents and profits. This was also the principal problem of political economy, according to David Ricardo. Of course, this interest in class-based analysis in economics has faded away with the marginalist revolution. However, what we are seeing today is a revival somehow of functional income distribution. As Atkinson said a few years ago, factors shares are making a comeback. And since then, we have witnessed in the last 20 years an increasing number of works that try to find the causes for shifts in functional income distribution, and that also use functional income distribution, the labor share, as independent variable. So it came back into the debate. However, what we have noticed, and our point of departure, is that this growing attention towards functional income distribution and the labor share has not been accompanied by a reflection on the underlying classes that are behind the labor share. And we believe that this is important. And this is important because, of course, today, social classes are not the same as they were 200 years ago. And it's important because there are few factors that kind of change the scenario compared to 200 years ago. In this paper, what we do is to consider two factors. There might be more, we only focus on two. The first one is the fact that individuals earn often multiple sources of income. Workers who receive a wage also can receive rents and therefore capital income, for example. At the same time is the role of managers, as I was saying, linking with what we have been discussing. Managers, as we know, are a peculiar kind of workers because they tend to receive wage as part of their income. However, it could be argued that their main function, their main interests are more aligned with those of the capitalists. Actually, it was funny because we enjoyed a lot this part of the paper because we found a very large and diverse literature basically arguing on this point, saying that manager could be considered more closer to capitalists rather than workers. And of course, here we have a problem compared to the estimation when we talk about the labor share of income. And we have a problem because today we have individuals that contribute both to the capital income and the labor income. Therefore, we cannot find a linear correspondence between sources of income and class location. And then we have a group of workers that we, and together with a large group of authors, argue that should be considered part of the capitalist class. Therefore, what we do is basically to take into account these two aspects, multiple sources of income and the role of managers, to come up with a novel class definition, and from there we address two research objectives. The first one is try to define how the share of income received by laborers and capitalists, as we're going to define them, links to measures of personal income distribution, and therefore the Gini coefficient, for example. And second, we investigated the class composition of top incomes employing the class definition that we propose. This is the class scheme that we're going to employ. The main differences here, I don't have much time, but basically are what I mentioned. The role of managers, that we consider capitalists, and the fact that when we have individuals or households receiving multiple sources of income, we consider the main source of income in order to define where they are. So for example, a teacher, therefore a wage earner typically, that also receives some rents, if this rent is lower than the salary, it will still be a teacher. If this teacher has large rents because whatever reason, then it will become a rentier because the main type of income is a rent, but of course, this person also receives a salary. Then, of course, we have traditional capitalists, people who own a business and receive profits as their main source of income, self-employed, but leave them there, and rentiers, who are those who have properties and financial incomes as main source of income, basically. We operationalize this framework using surveys, household surveys from Italy, Germany, and Spain, basically. We have standard social demographic variables. Importantly, we need data on the occupations to extract the managers. Flows of income, different sources, and the stock of wealth, which usually is at the household level to do further tests. In what I'm going to present, the results are at the household level. However, we also perform the same test at the individual level, and basically, there are no major changes. Just some very basic accounting. Total income is going to be equal to the different sources of income from labor, profits, self-employment, and property income, that is rents and financial income. And then here we have that capitalists and laborers can receive all types of income, all the different sources of income, of course, in different magnitudes. Capitalists will have profits as main source of income, laborers will have wages as main sources of income. From there, what we do is to estimate what we call the laborers and capitalists' share of income. That is not the labor share, not the capital share. We define what the class receives in terms of total income. This is what we get, basically. The dashed line would be the standard labor share, and we see that the laborers' share of income is somehow below. Here we have two forces. The fact that we move managers in capitalist drives the laborers' share down. The fact that we have laborers receiving capital income drives the laborers' shares up. In this case, what prevails is the role of managers pushing down the labor share, basically. From here, what we do is to address the two main research objectives. The first one was to link our measure of laborers' share of income to personal income distribution. The first thing we do here is to perform a Lerman-Yazaki decomposition of the Gini index. Basically, what this composition does is to establish how the Gini coefficient at the country level, therefore an index of personal inequality, would react when there is a change in 1%, 1 unit of one of the sources of income. And what we obtain is what you can see in this graph. We have the first and last year, but the results are pretty much the same. And we have the three countries, Spain, Germany, and Italy. What we see is basically that all sources of income received by laborers are negative, and therefore an increase of those sources of income would reduce personal inequality. On the other hand, what we have is that all sources of income received by the capitalists, that can be profits, capital income, property incomes, and wages, would drive up the level of personal inequality. So this is important to say that it's not only increasing wages that will reduce personal inequality. It depends who basically receives these wages, and laborers should receive these wages in order to reduce personal inequality. Along this line, what we do is also to link our measure of laborers' share with personal income distribution, performing opla. You're fine. We perform an unconditional interquartile distribution, a RIF OLS, which for what matters here basically is a bit more sophisticated than a standard OLS estimation, but the results can be interpreted in a similar way. And what we see basically, here we have the dependent variable that is the Gini coefficient, and the variable of interest is the laborer's share of income. And as expected, what we see is that higher laborer's share of income has a negative association with the level of personal inequality, that is the Gini coefficient. So with respect to the first objective, we see that higher laborer's share of income reduce inequality fundamentally. And then here we move to the second objective, that was to study the top income composition. And again, we do this employing our framework of analysis. Here, what we do first is to show the standard, the total wage share, the total labor share of income along the decile of the distribution. As expected, what we see is that the labor share is higher in the bottom quantiles, and as we move towards the top of the decile of the distribution, the presence of wages diminishes. It's also relevant to note that despite it diminishes, it doesn't disappear. There is wage income in the top decile, and these reflect what the literature was saying, growing presence of labor income in the top deciles. However, what we also show with the red line is that mostly this income is, or at least significantly, this income in the top decile is received by capitalists, mostly managers, not laborers, not what we call laborers. And in fact, what we see is that the distance between the red line, that is the wage shares of laborers only, that is wages that are received only by laborers, the two lines are very close when we are at the bottom of the distribution, and they tend to amplify, and this distance is mainly based by the portion of what we call capitalists that receive wages, mostly managers, basically. Along this line, what we also do is to develop the income factor concentration index that has been developed by Marco Ranaldi, who is here. And this index takes values, correct me if I'm wrong. No? Okay. This index takes values comprised between -1 and 1, basically. 1, when all capitalists are at the top of the distribution. That is, all capital income is at the top of the distribution. We have an index that is equal to 1, and labor income is below. An index that is equal to 0 means that capital income and labor income are mixed. Okay? There is no prevalence along the distribution of capital and labor income. An index that is lower than 1 means the opposite. That is, the labor income is found at the top of the distribution, which is a very unlikely situation. What we do is to estimate the standard IFC index, that is using the sources of income, and also to estimate another class-based IFC index using our definition of classes. We substitute capital income with capitalist income, and we substitute labor income with laborer's income, which again comprises all sources of income, not only wages or profits. And what we get is basically this. The standard IFC index that is the one using the sources of income, labor and capital, is the dashed line here, constantly stands below what we have using the class-based IFC. This means that, according to our classification, what we have is a higher polarization of classes within the 3 countries analyzed. And the difference is actually quite significant, and in some cases it's even increasing, such as the case of Spain. So basically, our conclusion is, once we embody once we consider the characteristics of our contemporary capitalism, what we get is a picture of class polarization, class divide that is stronger than sometimes it's believed. So basically, as a way of conclusions, first, we find that the Gini decomposition reveals that only wages received by labor, what we call laborers, contributes to reduce inequality. Also the other sources of income, but the other sources of income are much less relevant compared to wages. And also we find, as we expected, a negative relationship between the laborer's share of income and the Gini coefficient, basically. Second, with respect to our second objective, in line with existing evidence, what we see is that there is a significant presence of wages at the top of the distribution. However, this presence of wages can be largely determined by what we call capitalists, mostly managers. And also, by using a class-based IFC index, what we see is that this class divide is much more pronounced than would normally be. Therefore, as a way of general conclusion, we argue that income sources alone might be tricky and a bit misleading when trying to assess and determine class belonging only, and we need to consider other aspects as well. Second, we have proposed a framework that we believe is also flexible enough to consider other aspects. We haven't discussed this, but we could also include the level of wealth as determinant of class location, for example. And third, we conclude that a class divide is still present, and it is more pronounced than what is usually estimated using the standard approach of labor share. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I would like to invite the discussants to help us make sense of all this representation. And the first one is Lia Pacelli. Welcome. Lia Pacelli is Associate Professor at the University of Torino.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to this very stimulating and nice workshop. I think that I will be very brief, and I try to highlight what is probably key messages that we can take home from this first part of the discussion. The first one, I mean, it's kind of obvious, but still very crucial, that is data are crucial. So good, detailed, and timely data on inequality and large coverage of country times and top earners, for example, are extremely, of course, to monitor and to study the causes of inequality. That is what we try to do. But I think this is important also to be able to agree on what is happening and to contrast narratives that try to tell a different story with respect to trends in inequality, to contrast what we call now fake kind of information. So and here we see that there is a lot of effort in the profession to try to make sense of the data that are extremely difficult to collect and to make comparable. So the first thing is, this is extremely important, and this is something that we, there is not such a huge reward in spending time to collect and clear the data, and this is mostly for the young professionals that are here, that are, this is something that, it's not really rewarded, but it's extremely important for the meaning of our profession. The second thing that is, that strikes me is that the causes of inequality or equalizing processes generate effects that are extremely persistent over time. For individuals and even across generations. So think about education, for example. So if we increase education, this improves, and there is huge literature on this improves the standard of living of those who actually benefit for the increased education, but benefits also their offsprings, for example. Health as well. We have experienced with COVID now what is the unequal effect of a health threat that will last over time. We see it, in terms of medical health, psychological health, ability to learn, and so on and so forth. But also conflicts. They destroy countries, they destroy the social, tissue of the social links, but also the ability to, to equalize. So all these things are extremely persistent, and also the ability to accumulate savings and capital, so the last presentation, so to have rents with, along with wages as a, a source of incomes. And this actually is important also in two sides. One is that the returns of policies that try to increase or decrease inequality go beyond the political cycle. So if you invest in education, the returns on this will be, accrued much after the political cycle will be over, so new elections and so on and so forth. So this is, as everything that is a long-run investment, is, it's probably increases the incentives for politicians to invest in something for to reduce inequality, for which next generations of politicians will get the returns. But on the other hand, it's more difficult to reverse the sign of these policies because the effects are persistent. So if we change the aim of the policies, it's difficult to undo what has been done, and we see it with all the neoliberal kind of policies that are in place that are very difficult to reverse, in a sense. And finally, that is linked to what I was saying now, policies matter a lot, of course. We saw this incredible graph, the V graph on the 1980 that goes up, and this is very clear in every country. So when neoliberal policies prevail, we have an increase in inequality. When we have a left turn, then inequality kind of decreases. And so I'm not a political scientist, but what is, I think, challenging is to understand how to change the direction, how to change the allocation of power that determines the fact that we have more neoliberal or less neoliberal kind of policies. And this is what really strikes me about the to-do kind of challenge that we all face about not only studying this phenomenon and make it clear and discuss it, but also how to change the mainstream narrative and the mainstream approach to this kind of policies. And I stop here because I don't want to take this one.
Thank you very much, Leah. And the second discussant is Mario Pianta, Professor of Economic Policy here at Scuola Normale Superiore.
Thank you very much. This is a very lively discussion converging in unexpected ways, and also the last paper we will present has to do with Italy's 1% of waged earners, so there is a very close. So very quickly, the common question on which I think we should focus is the search for the drivers of these dynamics, the drivers of the graphs that James has shown, and behind this there is clearly a change in the balance of power between capital and labor, which was one of the points in our book with Maurizio years ago, which has to be documented in specific ways. And here, a clear specification, in my view, has to do with finance. So my question to James is, in your estimated indicator, the focus is on manufacturing industry and the share in the overall economy and the distribution of wages within it. So how, to what extent you trust this to capture also the expansion of financial activities, which of course is more important in highly advanced countries rather than across the board. But so in this sense, what are the processes that may be left out of your story in driving inequality? I think I like the class story. I think this is a reasonable way forward. And linking this to Maurizio's point, clearly in the context of a capitalist economy, the compensation of managers is part of the profit. It's part of what is a new configuration of the capitalist class, where you have not anymore the old family capitalist of last century, and the shareholders are just one part of the owners of shares, but the key strategic role is performed by managers. And a lot of work, think of Lazonic and other people, has focused on the importance of this reconfiguration of the capitalist class and of the model of corporate governance and of the criteria that is really guiding what you have been discussing. So maximizing shareholder values and short-termism and all these things. In this sense, I would conceptualize, I agree with you, so I would conceptualize the compensation of managers functionally and structurally as a part of the profits, which is redistributed to a subset of the capitalist class. And this, I think, makes clear the interest of the CEO to operate in that way, and therefore their extreme power position that shows why the corrected data that you show have such a big difference when you take this money out of the wage share. So this is one interesting story, but again, the importance of financial dimension is important. Clearly, this game requires basically a dynamics which is not really driven by the volumes of output, but is driven by the escalation of asset values in stock markets, because of course a lot of the compensation of CEO is on stock option, and so is related to a dynamics which is not rooted in the real economy dynamics, but is more rooted in the financial dynamics, in the financial bubbles. So this would be also an interesting aspect to explore. By the way, on this, I think it would be interesting to see the numbers in terms of demographics and social structures of this recalculation that you have done, and the reconfiguration of the income share, which has to be explained. So the recalculated income share, the next step is a bit trivial to say Gini goes down if more wages to laborers are paid. So what is behind this? So what are the drivers that we identify between these evolving recalculated shares? On the superstar, the story is different, clearly. So, but my intuition would be that we should treat them a little bit in the same way as we treat digital platforms. In other words, technology that you rightly pointed out creates the possibility for a market power which is extremely larger, so an audience that is worldwide, a global audience of concerts or of soccer players. And this is, given the present structure of intellectual property rights and rents assignment, this is concentrated in the hands of a few large teams, music companies, and then key players in this game who are able to appropriate a large part of this. It is clear that this is not, it's difficult to conceptualize. Is this rent? Is this profit? Is this a part of the profit of the music company which goes to the music star and so on? But this combination of the technological characteristics of platform, the targeting of global audience, at the same time widening global audiences, but also targeting the specific users that are interested in this. And this monopoly power position seems to me an interesting explanation of the concentration of power they have. But we can continue the discussion later.
We still have quite a bit of time for questions, discussions, answers, and so on. I see already some hands, but then I will certainly give the floor back to the speakers. Luigi Pellizzoni at the back. Please.
Okay, I start. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I would like to raise 2 points. One related to the first 2 presentations. I would like to ask if there is no elephant in the room to consider, which means how is it that these growing trends of inequality has not raised so much social conflict? So because you gave a different source of, let's say, structural, in a broad sense, explanations. But a very important point is the legitimization of growing inequality without any major turmoil or whatever. This is particularly evident in the case of the top managers and whatever, but in general also in the exchange between countries. So the problem of the ideology, the hegemonic ideology that has been able to establish itself in such a way that to legitimize increasing inequalities under the promise of future benefit for everybody, and this is enduring for decades. This is a very important question. So I would like to know what you think. About the third presentation, I possibly missed some point, because if I understood, you defined the new definition of class according to a split of the original classes into different, for example, the private entrepreneur, the self-entrepreneurs according to the top level of self-entrepreneurs based on income, I suppose. But then you enter into some kind of tautology, in my view, because, of course, if you establish that the top level of these people take more money, and then you go through your analysis, you find they actually take more money, this is not a big finding. I mean, while the original definition of class by Marx has a root in the structure of production, so you can discuss whether or not capitalists take more money with respect to laborers. Now, if you start by the difference in income, you end up with difference in income. So, possibly I'm totally wrong. I missed some part of the explanation of the new description of class composition based on income rather than objective position in the structure of production.
Thank you. And we have on this, yes, please, Valeria.
Yes, I have a question for Davide and Luca, just a clarification, curiosity. Because myself, I tried in the past to link functional and personal distribution of income, realizing that in fact you have mixed income along the entire personal distribution. How do you tackle the issue of private pensions? Like old, for example, old people, they have poor public pensions. Sometimes they integrate with private pension. At the end, you can end up with some paradoxical situation where these people at the end, if you consider the prevalence of the source of income, then how do you tackle this situation? That is actually something that also occurred during the pandemic, and possibility to earn the reddito di cittadinanza, because you have this situation of asset-rich, cash-poor people, so people that basically they don't have money, but because they have the house, they don't have the possibility, the chance to have this support scheme. And also another curiosity, how do you deal with the gender issues? Because when you consider the income at the level of household, I know there are several constraints in terms of sources of income, but then you end up maybe not properly tackling also the individual, sources of inequality. How you, and if you think to integrate the gender analysis in this class story. Thanks.
Thank you. Dominique Meda, please.
Thank you for your fascinating presentation. I have several questions. The first is for James Galbraith. What is taken into account in your measures? Only income or also wealth? For example, property ownership? Because as David Villani said, there are several sources of wealth. Another question for James Galbraith and Maurizio Franzini. Have you been able to compare the level of inequality between countries that have taken measures to increase taxes on dividends and those that have not? And a question for David Villani. Why do you place professors who have less capital income than their income with workers? Do you evaluate and take into account property and the value of assets? It's the same question for all of you. Since inequalities today are explained more by the possession of assets than by income, as Piketty has shown. And finally, do you agree that one of the solutions to this problem is to give power back to the working class and to stop believing in the agency theory?
Oh, yes, another one, please.
Maybe just a quick one for the three wonderful panelists. Thank you for the presentation. And maybe it's very quick, and it's just, I was pretty surprised not to hear anything about heritage, because we are speaking about the top, and I was pretty surprised not to have any kind of mention to the role of inheritance and family sort of background in the top 1%, at least in Italy, for what I'm trying to look at. Thank you.
Good. Oh, yes, well, we never end, but it's very good. Please introduce yourself if you can as well.
Hi, I'm Lorenzo Pellegrini, and I jump in because I heard about inheritance and then I think taxes, so which is the other great equalizer, no? On the one hand, inheritance, and of course, with inheritance, great equalizer is also if the offspring is able to squander the money, squander the capital. I think that's ceteris paribus, a great way to redistribute. And then structurally, we would like to see more taxes. And taxes also, of course, on assets. In fact, I think for me, the other question for Professor Galbraith would be how the picture changes if we look at assets rather than income distribution. Thanks.
You, please.
So I'm Jelena Redic. Thank you, all of you, for wonderful presentations. I just have one quick observation on Professor Franzini's presentation. I pretty much agree with what Mario has been saying, that probably you should look, when it comes to the compensation of the CEOs, into the financialization, that not only prioritize returns to shareholder value, but also impacted the compensation of the CEOs. Although you pointed out that compensations were growing 37% more than the financial returns, but I think that that financialization can be, is one of the key drivers of the CEO's compensations. Because I think that's the important thing. You haven't really mentioned the policy implications, so how we should deal with it. And I think in order to, to come up with policy solutions, we really need to understand what are the real drivers of this phenomenon. And another question for Davide. I'm very sympathetic with your analysis, but I was also wondering when actually the boundaries between capital and labor income start blurring. I think it starts somewhere at the top, and how relevant this is in the developing world. Okay, because your analysis was on 3 advanced economies. I assume that due to the different structure of economies, and also, again, that in the developing world, this is not really the case. This blurring between the labor and capital income. So, thanks.
Thank you very much for all these questions. Now, it's difficult to answer them all. There were quite a few about these contradictory class positions of people earning a better in this way and a better way. I wouldn't doubt your capacity. It's probably of time, but it's not a doubt on intellectual capacity at all. But we will try. There were some questions about policy responses and political consequences of all this. Please, James, and then the other 2 speakers also will have an opportunity.
Okay, thank you. Let me just take them up, not necessarily in order, but first Mario's question, how does this work capture or not capture the role of financial and capital incomes? Well, what I showed you was the relationship of our estimates of household income inequality to everybody else's estimates for a wide selection of countries. And what that shows you is that our estimates are very close to the survey estimates. It's just that ours are more continuous and more consistent than in most cases. The one major exception is the United States, where after the early 1990s, there is a substantial divergence. And the reason for that is that in the US, there are estimates of the role of realized capital gains in income. They come from the CBO and other places, and they show a kind of sawtooth pattern with the rise and fall of the stock market. These are incomes attributed to a very small part of the population, and they are not captured characteristically in surveys. And this is a problem everywhere. So I don't know whether the consistency of our measure with surveys in Europe and Asia and Africa and other places is because those capital incomes don't exist or because they're not measured. I can't distinguish between those 2 propositions, but they're not there in anybody's data, and they're not in ours. But they are for you can tell in the United States. And that's about the only case where I can say you can definitely tell. Okay, classification schemes. On a different track of research, I proposed a method which was to use cluster analysis on the annual rate of change of earnings or wages for different occupational or industrial groups. And when you do that, you can, in the case of the United States, this was a book I published in the late 1990s, you can discern a very distinct sort of empirical basis for defining a class structure in the economy. And basically there were 3 large groups. There was the service sector, where everybody is paid the minimum wage plus some premium, depending upon what it is, but it's all very stable, and by the way, very egalitarian at a low level. And then there's what I called the C sector, which was for capital-intensive industries, where you had a labor management negotiation and a dividing up of a surplus. This is automobiles, aerospace, and things. And then there was something which was called the K sector, which was the technology sector and the financial sector. And the sky's the limit. It's a completely different atmosphere because everybody's competing to be at the front of the queue. They're all gamblers in a big lottery to become the next Oracle or the next Apple or the next Microsoft or the next whatever it is these days, and Google or whatever. And so the incomes in that sector are extremely high. And this is a very small part of the economy, but it dominates the movement of inequality, finance and technology does. And there are a number of ways you can show this, not with this very generic industrial data, but in the US we have, for example, data, income tax data by county. And we were able to show that in the 1990s, 50% of the increase of between county inequality across 3,150 counties was due to the rising income in 5 counties. The 5 counties, it will not surprise you to learn, were, first of all, New York, Wall Street, Manhattan, Wall Street. 3 counties in Northern California, Santa Clara, San Francisco, and San Mateo. And 1 county in the state of Washington, King County, which is location. Just very straightforward. And 15 counties accounted for all of it. So that may come to the question of why there isn't such an enormous amount of social conflict associated with this measured rise in inequality. It's very remote from most people's experience. Most communities don't see this. They read about Elon Musk. Okay, he's my neighbor, but you know, he's a remote character for most people. It's not happening in your hometown necessarily. It's happening across a large country. Okay, that's the second point. The third one is what is the nature of that technology and financial sector? It's about the concentration of capital values. It's about taking what was formerly a scientific sector associated with large industrial corporations, Bell Labs, for example, or IBM, for example, and concentrating it in a separately capitalized enterprise where a small number of people could control the capital flow. And that's why these firms have, which are very small firms with 10 or 15,000 employees, a tiny fraction of the automobile industry, have trillion-dollar valuations in the stock market. That's why Jeff Bezos, for example, is Jeff Bezos, whoever he actually is. Okay, that's what's going on in terms of the rise of the income at the top. Fourth point has to do with this question of who are the CEOs really? This is another very small class. So there's only 4. The Fortune 500 has only 500 CEOs. So that's a theorem, by the way. There's 1 per company. So that's 500 people at any given time. Only a fraction of those are at the top echelon. So you might be talking about 100, 150. And I would argue, the way to think of them is as advertisements for their companies. They are paid to show how important the company is. And that makes Jamie Dimon or somebody like that into a national political figure, which he would otherwise not be because he's an insignificant person. As a person, he'll be replaced by somebody else in due course. But if he's paid X million dollars, he's always identified publicly by how much he's worth and how much he's paid. This gives him an importance he wouldn't from an advertising standpoint. Okay, so that was the 4th point. The 5th point had to do with assets and the measurement of assets and inheritances and all of that. Why not study wealth? The answer is there's very little you can study. It's very hard to know what is wealth. Income, I know what it is because, first of all, there's relatively consistent definitions, both the survey takers, but even more importantly, in advanced countries, your tax authority tells you what your income is. It tells you that your wages and your salaries and your realized capital gains are income, but your unrealized capital gain isn't, and your insurance payment isn't, and your legal settlement isn't, and on and on. So you want to know your income, you can read it off a form. What's your wealth? Good luck. In the United States, it's appraised at death for rich people. So you learn once what people are really, and you know their financial assets, but that's another very murky area. But what is their real estate worth? What is their, good luck. It's very, very hard to study. It's obviously very important, but when you're preoccupied, as I have been with, and you said, with this mucky business of working on data, which is, I'm lucky in a policy school. I didn't have to worry about whether I would be rewarded for doing this. You work with what you have at hand and what's readily available. The great advantage of the approach that we took is it was extremely easy. Data were all lying around, nobody was using them. We pulled them out of spreadsheets, we pulled them out of public documents. We went to China and brought back statistical yearbook and just copied. We went to Russia and brought back statistical yearbooks and just copied the numbers and ran spreadsheet calculations. That was all that was required to do a massive amount of work. You didn't need millions of dollars to conduct a survey or anything like that. So from that point of view, I couldn't have done the same thing. I was following a path of least resistance. I couldn't have done the same thing any other way. Finally, the question of policy. The one thing I would say, given what I observe, is that a country or a region needs to control its own financial universe. Capital controls have been of central importance to the stability of China and its rise over the last 30 years. The liberalization in India raised inequality in India. Go down the list. The sanctions have been extremely good for stabilizing the social situation in Russia. Gift from that point of view. So having the ability to separate your financial fate from the dictates of London and New York is probably the single most important thing. And by the way, the European Central Bank and all of the memoranda of understanding and everything else that we tried to resist in Greece without any success in 2015. But that would be, that's the conclusion I draw. This is a monetary and macroeconomic phenomenon. All the talk about, skills and labor markets and this and that in education is secondary to the fact that inequality is created by people who want to create inequality. My father used to say, people who have money to lend tend to have more money than people who do not have money to lend. And when you raise the interest rate that people who do not have money to lend have to pay, this is going to affect the distribution in favor of people who have money. It's an extremely simple proposition. Confront it or you're not going to get anywhere in the long run. Okay, that's my 6 answers to 6 questions.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. And we...
Okay, thank you. I want to say something to, in some sense, make it clear what I meant by my intervention. My question was why those people earn that amount of money, not to establish whether they're part of one class or another. That's make a difference. It's compatible with the idea that they're part of that class. But the question is, why do they earn so much? That's a new feature. Something which we are not able to explain easily, and we lack a lot of analysis of this phenomenon. What I wanted to stress is that please look at those, because very rich people now can arise because of those phenomena, which are relatively new. Okay? So as to the CEO, my idea is that they cannot be, I have some difficulty in saying that what they earn is profit, Mario. Why? Because they earn something which is not related, in some sense can reduce profits. Okay, what they earn. There are conflicts, huge conflicts between CEO and shareholders in many instances. So can we say that this is a section of the capitalist class which is in conflict with the other capitalist class? This could be interesting, but let's identify that they are not doing the interests of the general class of capitalists. They can be in contrast. Think of the asset manager coming from the. They are terrible. They have an enormous power against the shareholders, not for doing the interests of the. So I think that we should pay attention to this phenomenon, which I consider to be a new feature of contemporary capitalism. as well as the phenomenon of zero marginal cost. Remember that, as I said, this was considered to be a feature which would lead to the overcoming capitalism. It is reinforcing capitalism. It is making capitalism even more terrible than it was before, okay? And we don't say much about that. I think that, as someone has said, the ground under our feet is collapsing, and we are not completely aware that this is happening, so we have to pay attention to it. As to specific aspects, what I suggested is that the power of the manager, whatever they are, manifests itself in the presence of growth, okay? And so what they can do is to draw today in their pocket, to pocket a larger share of the increase in the wealth and the income produced. It is a kind of soft power. It is a kind of soft power because it finds less resistance. If you go to the shareholder and say, well, your dividends will be reduced because my compensation, probably you will not succeed. But if you are in a context of growth where you can tell the shareholder, you get more, but I don't tell you how much more I get than you, okay? So you cannot control. This is something which can take place, but I'm not sure. That's an hypothesis. All the other explanations I found are not convincing. Okay, very confused idea of what the power is, other explanation which I found really unconvincing. This is, of course, a lot of empirical work has to be done in order to give support to this idea, but I mean, the first impression is that could fit into the data I was saying in a very preliminary way, okay? See that, what they get. And there are more serious analysis of the fact that when the size of the firm grows, okay, when the firm is greater, the share of total value added going to the CEO is also greater. And this is compatible with what I said. It comes through the process of growth, which allows to capture more. Maybe I'm wrong, but I would say that do not let us understand that things are changing. You can put them to the old categories. You can be felt challenged to adapt the categories to what. But please do not forget that we have this phenomenon which is new. People doing a lot of money out of something which we are not able to explain. I think that this is something which should worry us. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And yeah, please. They're stealing your name.
Thanks. I mean, this was like a very interesting discussion, and all the themes were extremely connected, mostly with Maurizio, but also with Galbraith. Evolution of inequality. So taking into account the questions about the elephant in the room, I think that mostly of the economic literature is trying, after the neoliberal evolution, to think as we are in a classless society, and this, I think, I mean, in our paper, we try to, in a way, stress the importance of class in the analysis of inequality, and I think personally that this may also play a role, that thinking that we are a classless society may, like trying to decrease the level of conflict and trying to accept higher level of income inequalities. And related to the point of kind of tautology, this is mostly related to the part of the self-employed. Because, for example, I mean, we basically use the structural production approach, as in Marx. I mean, we select the household head, for example, and if he or she is a wage earner, so he has forced to, or she has forced to sell her workforce to get money and to survive. This is basically a wage earner that is exactly as in the vein of Marx or classical sociology. What we do is to theorize more about managers. So we start from the old-fashioned literature about ownership and control. The managerialist theory, which may be useful for Franzini, versus Weber or even Olin Wright, a theoretical approach trying to explain that the distinction between ownership and control is not a threat to the structural classical class approach. So based on this theoretical framework, we follow this kind of traditional sociological approach to classify the wage earners versus the capitalists. So the only tautology is indeed for the self-employed, based on whether they belong to the bottom 2/3 or to the top 1/3, which is a standard rule in the literature, even by the OECD. What we did is try to exclude the self-employed, which are the most problematic class, but results mostly are very, very similar. And indeed, following on the points raised by Valeria Cirillo, we don't take into account pensions. We acknowledge the problem at the beginning, and we opt to focusing on the active production of the population. So we were thinking that we want to focus on the pure market forces and see what happens in the poor market. So to avoid the redistributive or distribution part that may be played by pensions, which are postponed wages. And about the gender issue, yeah, this is like a great point. I mean, we can definitely check whether we have differences by gender. We didn't check any of heterogeneities. But my guess would be that the distance could be lower between the two curves, mostly because we have fewer women among the managers. As for the role of the value assets, as Davide was mentioning, we tested some other class models where we take into account wealth. So we consider the net value of wealth. And we test different scenarios where we include the top wealthy individuals among the capitalist class or as a class itself. So we create this new class called as wealthy. And check again the robustness of our results, and we see, of course, that they tend to increase, of course, the level of overall inequality at personal level. About the last points for the developing world, of course, they may have a different production system where the role of mixed incomes may be less important compared to developed world, also due to the issue of finance that was raised before. So I guess that again the two curves would be closer compared to the advanced economies. And the same for the role of inheritance and taxes. Of course, inheritance is a great driver of inequalities, and not only in terms of firm or values, assets, whatever received, but also in terms of the parents' class location, for example. And this is observed in the returns to education, for example, and then transmitted on the labor market. This is, again, a great driver. Unlikely to measure the exact role of inheritance is a bit more problematic just in terms of access to the data. Thinking on Italian administrative data, we cannot access the fiscal data, and we do not observe the exact role of inheritance. Or, for example, there is a great paper by Miles Korak about the inheritance of the employers. So whether the son or daughters of a given individual is working for the same employer. And this could be, again, another important role of inheritance.
And lastly, for taxes, again, we just focus on gross values for Germany and net values, unlikely for Italy and Spain, as we cannot distinguish the role played by taxes. But this is just to a data limitation, but it would be, of course, a great importance.
Thank you very much for everybody for this. In terms of gender inequality, this session I recognize was a little bit unequal in the sense that it was a bit like the men presenting and the women asking questions. But the next one will be a little bit better. So there'll be a trend which is positive, and let's hope the future will be much better. Thank you, everybody, for the presentations. On pensions, I think the question was not, if I understood it well, was not about redistribution. It was about the fact that pensions in a private system, they're not deferred wages, but they're wages that become capital. And they make a little bit of the worker a bit capitalist, which answer a little bit the questions from Luigi Pellicino. We'll discuss it more later. In the meanwhile, for those who really enjoyed, which I guess is everybody, including those online, the topic today, I remind you, on Friday we will we'll hear more from James on entropy economics on his Ciampi lecture, whereas given the topic of zero marginal cost was mentioned and the huge expansion of market was expansion where platforms obviously come into play, we have the following Ciampi lecture with Kathleen Taylor on the Amazon's economy. So we are bringing everything together. Wait for us and we'll get a big theory that will explain everything about inequality and capitalism. We are working on it. Thank you. You deserve a little break, and we gather in 15 minutes. Thank you. Everybody's there, more or less. We start the second half of Inequality today with Michele Raitano, who is a professor at Sapienza University in Rome and a big expert of inequality and poverty in Italy. And he will talk about income inequality in times of inflation in Europe. The floor is yours.
I started to work with Massimo Prea that is here because we tried also with Maurizio, we are trying to think about what is the impact of inflation on inequality. So my presentation will be based on these three main issues. The first one is trying to think about how inflation might affect inequality. If you look for books, for papers about trends of inequality, you will never find that inflation is a possible driver of inequality. You will never find in the list. Why? This happens, I will try to make some hints about this issue. After this theoretical background, I will shortly propose one empirical exercise that is about how a possible way to look for an effect of price increase in a certain type of goods, especially foods. What is the effect of increase in foods? And I will explain why I focus on foods, on the distribution of well-being, of inequality, on poverty and inequality in selected EU countries. What is really interesting is that if you work on data, you have a microdata set on inequality. You know that if you work with real or nominal income, nothing changes, unless you consider very specific indicators. But if you work on relative poverty and on in any type of inequality index, a good inequality index, all these indexes are by definition unaffected by price levels. Because if you multiply all incomes by the same amount, by definition, inequality is a relative. If you measure absolute poverty, something changes. But if you measure relative inequality, it doesn't change. On the other hand, there is another issue, because I consider it as an issue, especially if you want to compare countries and especially if you want to compare the same country over time. Because we usually measure inequality by looking at a certain proxy of well-being. And the proxy that has been decided by statisticians, first of all, is the equivalized disposable income. That has a lot of drawback because equivalized disposable income does not take into account in-kind transfer, does not take into account the value of the housing, does not take into account, as I told you, what we consider basic needs. Over time, whether the prices or whether the importance of these goods change along the distribution, we may have a different distribution of well-being that is the distribution of well-being that we observe if we only focus on disposable income. This is a sort of paradox. If you talk with statisticians, economists by the Bank of Italy, they argue that inequality in Italy is not increasing at all. If you take USILT data for Italy, if you take Bank of Italy data, there is a sort of plateau. Inequality does not increase did not increase, but we all have the perception. If you look data proposed by Maurizio, or data on the labor market, but also data on labor income, we find a steep increase. Why it happens? And there is so the issue of the proxy variable. So we have, if we want to take into account for inflation in distributive analysis, there are two related issues from my point of view. The first issue is that there is what has been called inflation inequality. I suggest you to read an interesting policy brief made by Davide Villani on that surveys a bit of literature, that is inequality price levels and also inflations are not equal for all individuals because of three issues. First of all, individuals spend different shares of their income in different goods. And if we follow the Engel idea, the goods also change by income. And so there is an effect. And this is the classical type of between goods inequality. But there are clear evidence of within goods inequality because you select different types of quality within a large group, or because for the same type of goods you have, if you are richer, you are more informed, you have better information about how to buy. Think to the different possibility of buying online if you are richer and you have higher information. So there is a problem of inflation inequality, and there is a recent literature to find that inequality, that inflation is pro-rich. The actual price followed by an individual is different. In this case, anyway, you are considering each class of goods. The second approach, the second issue that I consider that is related but is not exactly the same, is that if we want to measure individual well-being, maybe we should consider what is actually disposable to you for your consumption once you have fulfilled your basic needs. Okay? Because the idea of equalized disposable incomes comes from the fact that it is a good proxy of potential consumption in any type of good. But goods are not the same. And so my idea is, what is the distribution of income net of the spending for basic goods? And now inflation and price levels clearly takes a role, because basic goods might have a certain type of inflation. Third related issue is that, of course, incomes change over time. Apart from that, there may be behavioral responses by the individuals, or there may be heterogeneity in contract renewals, indexation rules, according to the different income sources. This is the three ways according to which we can try to deal with inflation in inequality analysis. The issue of inflation inequality, that is not the focus of our empirical exercise, but the issue of inflation inequality has one limit from my point of view, because first of all, it is extremely complex to compute individual level of inequality. For Italy, it cannot be possible because you need to have scanner data. There are some papers about the US. But there is also another problem, that consumption, as we know, consumption is affected by preferences. If we consider inflation inequality, you are also taking account different preferences for individuals that maybe something that is not what we consider with respect to individual well-being. And so we should try to depurate maybe the types of expenditure. And this is the reason why I consider it is more fruitful to focus on specific class of goods, or what we can consider basic needs from that point of view. And I try to follow on the so-called out-of-pocket approach. Out-of-pocket approach simply means that you depurate your income from the spending for certain basket of goods. Out-of-pocket approach, for instance, has been recently used by Dustman and colleagues on a paper on the Economic Journal to observe trends of the income inequality in Germany by depurating for the increasing prices of cost of the houses. And they notice that increase in inequality depurated from housing, that is a basic good by definition, is much steeper than the increase of inequality that you have in other terms. Of course, theoretically, you should depurate not the spending, but the spending of a basic basket of goods. If I want to drink Barolo each night, is something that is unrelated with my basic good. But anyway, especially if we look on poverty, but especially if we look on foods, we may argue that preferences as a second-order issue. That, for instance, if you focus on the type of car you drive or other type of issues. There is one problem anyway, that deciding what is the subsistence level is really troublesome. This is the reason why we do not have an absolute poverty line at European Union level, because using a reference budget approach across countries is extremely complex. But anyway, the idea is that assuming that food spending is less affected by preferences, especially if we look at the bottom part of the income distribution, out-of-pocket approach might allow us to have, on the one hand, a better picture of individual well-being, what the individual perceives as their well-being. Okay? On the other hand, also further hints about the effect of inflation, once we have data on that. So the empirical exercise is really simple from a methodological point of view, because we use USILC 2019, because USILC 2019 is an experimental wave where they have some information about some types of spending. To our aims, spending for foods and spending for private transport, but we did not use spending for private transport for some reason I will say in a while. And I compare 4 scenarios. The first is the standard Gini, the standard AROP, with the equalized disposable income. The second is the out-of-pocket without inflation. I only depurate disposable income by the spending that I have after foods. What I am free to decide what to spend after I have sustained my physical subsistence. The third one is that we increase the spending for food by the inflation rate on food. The fourth one is, okay, but also incomes might increase after inflation. We do not know how individual income have evolved, and we do not apply a macro simulation or behavioral model according to individual changes, but we propose different, very simple scenarios by income sources, where, first of all, for instance, we only index wages, we only index self-employment incomes, we only index transfers, and we get all that happens, and compare in the different scenarios the Gini and the AROP, the 60% of the median, equalized median income, relative poverty. The analysis is shown for major EU countries. Of course, this type of analysis can be run for all European Union countries. The spending for food is also a good variable because they have no missing values, so this is rather fine. What is important is the results are clearly some drivers. The drivers are 3. First of all, the share of the food spending on total income along the income distribution, of course. The second one is that there is inequality in inflation among the different types of goods. The harmonized index of the ICP is not equal to the inflation rate that you have for food, and where the gap is higher, and where poorest individuals spend more for foods, relatively you have higher effect in this type of simulation. And then there is, of course, the distribution of the income sources, where we assume that indexation is not the same according to the different income sources. By definition, if the pensioners are poorest, if I only index pension, indexation has a reduction in inequality effect. On the contrary, in Italy, where pensioners more or less are distributed similarly to the wage incomes, the effects are different. Okay? The limits of the empirical exercise is that, of course, we are not assuming any type of behavioral responses, neither with respect to labor supply and incomes, nor with respect to changing in consumption behavior. So if we had a disposal, and we hope that for Italy in future research, we may have a disposal, this type of basic basket of needs, we could be more strong on that type of issue. Of course, we consider only aggregate definition of country food inflation. We do not have differences by the quality of good, by the specific type of good. When we index income, we use net incomes to index. This is the reason why the first scenario is only for the countries in USILC that provides net incomes. And so, of course, we are assuming that there is no fiscal drag. Your net incomes move according to inflation, but this is something that is not so strong. We do not consider a huge issue is the heterogeneity in contracts, renewals, or indexation by wages. Yes. And maybe we are underestimating the true effect, especially with respect to the effect of indexation. But these are the issues. We did not consider transport for some reason. First of all, what is the inflation for transports? It is based on the energy cost for fuel, but it is also based on insurances, on repairments. So there are also a lot of missing values about that, and maybe the spending for preferences is much more stronger here, because, for instance, you might decide not to have a car for your decision, and it seems that you have no spending for Very, very short. I only show, for reasons of brevity, the graphs on Gini, trends on the Arop are similar. As you may notice, there is a large differences in inflation. In times of high inflation, inflation is not the same for different types of goods. You have on the left side for EU27, on the right side for Italy, you have the mean HICP, and you have the different inflation for the various types of goods. And for the various countries, differences are also starker. If we take the difference between HICP and food prices, you may notice a very large heterogeneity also across countries in the levels and also in the different gap. For instance, Italy is a country where food are rather similar. It's not so higher than the general inflation rates. For other countries, there is a very large gap in the two inflation rates. And the third factor, as I told you, is what is the share of spending for foods along the quintiles. As Engel argued, that this is one evidence that is also used to estimate equivalent scales. For instance, we know that the spending for food is a good proxy of well-being, because individuals, when they spend the same, you argue that they have the same well-being. And as you may notice, there are differences in levels, but also in the within quintile differences across countries. So countries differ according to that. As you may notice, in Italy, difference between the first and the other quintiles is much higher. In other countries, there is a smoother differences, for instance, in Germany and Denmark in the other quintiles. Results. What happened in the results? First of all, and this is something that, of course, we should observe over time, but we only have a cross-section on that. Once we depurate inequality by the spending for food, as expected, inequality increases a lot. If we also observe that that price has increased over time, of course, we should expect that. But if you compare the first and the second histogram, we find a very steep increase. What is the perception of inequality? Maybe it is related to that. Anyway, once we consider the inflation rate between 2019 and 2023 on food, we have a further increase that, of course, is higher, the higher the inflation rate. This is the reason why we took Hungary in that presentation, because, as you notice, Hungary has a 75% inflation rate on food. That is extremely striking from that point of view. What happens if you index? Be careful that the indexation does not simply mean that you will keep the same condition, because there is a difference between the different classes of goods. So if we take equalized income minus inflated spending for food, they're very simply, we inflate income by, as we had any type of income that is indexed, anyway, inequality increases. And this is something that usually is not considered, because usually we consider that the problem of inflation is solved once you index wages, when you renew wages. But what is the inflation rate you are considering to renew wages? How you are indexing? Because if you make partial indexation on the various income sources, you might find also some paradoxical result. For instance, things change across countries, because in the various countries it's very different, the share of the households earning the various share of income along the income distribution. But for instance, what you may notice in Italy is that if only capital incomes are indexed, in other terms, you have profit inflation and you are price maker, and so it is easier to adjust your income, inequality increases a lot. That might be considered also a sort of simulation of what may happen in the future after an inflation surge. If you argue that only the self-employed have the possibility to raise their nominal incomes after inflation, you have, in that case, this is the fourth lines. The comparison between the first and the fifth histogram are the same of the previous slide. But what is interesting is if we make a partial indexation, you only index pensions, inequality rises too, because there is a between effect between those households who earn wages and those households who earn pensions. But anyway, these are issues that should be considered. Anyway, inflation might have a long-lasting effect of inequality once, even if you are able to index. And so the trend of nominal income over terms might be determined by a steep inflation surge. So it is not neutral. I skipped the slides about the Arop. Effect on poverty are a bit starker, because, of course, you are focusing on the bottom part of the distribution. but relative terms are the same. There is also a simulation with Italy if we consider private transport, but it is the same. I go to the conclusion. What is my main message is be very careful, especially for the youngest scholar, not to argue, okay, we take disposable, equalize the disposable income. We need to be aware of the limits of any type of measure. Or, for instance, as also in previous presentation, you need to be clear about the limits of the measure and how much they can bias the estimates. But especially over time, we may have that. Think to the case of housing, for instance, that has not been considered here, because we do not know what is the inflation of housing cost, because in New Silk, we do not have specific information about housing cost for the rent or for the other repairments and other types. But if over time, you have a housing inflation, maybe inequality is not the same after housing. But individuals feel, in their relative comparison, they feel what is their wage or their wage net of what they are forced to spend for the housing or for the food, or it is the same. And so indexation alone is not the same. But in my view, the idea is, on the one hand, out-of-pocket approach is a very simple way to also have a better information, but it also allows us to reconcile some puzzle. With Maurizio, many times we intervene also in newspapers arguing why it is not a puzzle that in Italy inequality appears, and I underline appears, constant, while absolute poverty increases. Because absolute poverty is based on nominal prices on the cost of a basic of goods. Inequality acts in relative terms. But if we are able to consider that absolute poverty means a basket of goods that all individuals should be able to buy, and we consider the inequality after, for instance, you have bought that basket of goods, maybe it might be that also inequality, according to this issue, rises a lot. And so be careful about this type of implication going beyond the simple statistics that argue that there is no problem because the variable is unaffected by nominal versus real effects. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Michele. And I would like to move immediately to the second presentation by Marco Stamegna, who is a researcher here at Scuola Normale Superiore, and will present his research on wage inequality in occupational groups in Europe.
Okay, thank you for having organized this workshop. The title of my presentation is Wage Inequality Between Occupational Groups in Europe. This work is part of a joint project this work is part of a joint project with Valeria Cirillo, Mario Pianta, Elena Relic, and Riccardo Rinaldi. The goal the goal of this work is to find the drivers of wage disparities in Italy and across European industries. We have found 4 groups of variables, 4 groups of factors that are the main drivers of wage inequality: the increase in profits, the redistribution away from wage and towards profit; technology, that have different interaction, different types of relationship with income distribution; education, and labor market factors, labor market variables. How we define wage inequality? We use the standard international classification of occupation provided by the International Labour Organization, and we focused on the 2 extreme groups. So we focus on the top, occupational group, managers, and the bottom group. And we define wage inequality as a ratio of the wage of the 2 groups. I'm going to explain why in a while. So the analysis is based on a new industry-level database that combines data from the Sectoral Innovation Database that was developed a long time ago by Mario Pianta and others, that is combined with the wage data by occupational group from the Structure of Earnings Survey. Okay? This is the definition of the occupational groups adopted by the International Labour Organization on the right. The International Labour Organization distinguishes 9 occupational groups. that we group together into 4 categories. The top group is that of managers, then we have white collars, clerks, and the two categories of blue collars, the high-skilled ones, craft workers, and manual workers. Here you have the wage level in occupational groups by occupational group for the 4 countries that we are going to consider, Germany, France, Italy, and Spain, for the 3 years of observations for which we have data, 2010, 2014, and 2018. And what is immediate to see is that the trajectory of wages for the manual workers has been completely flat. Okay, so the key point here is that the cumulative increase, the increase over the whole period, has been only by less than 1%, for the manual workers, while wages for the other groups have grown much faster. Okay, so the overall picture is one of a complete stagnation in the wages of the bottom category, of the bottom group of manual workers. For this reason, we took as a measure of wage inequality the ratio between the top group and the bottom group. So, what are the main drivers of wage inequality? As is well known, according to the mainstream view, based on the skill bias technical change, the dynamics of wage inequality is totally determined by the interplay between demand and supply of skills as individual factors. So, new technologies are supposed to be complementary to high-skilled workers, so they drive up demand for skills. If labor supply through education keeps pace with increasing labor demand, wage inequality stays the same. Otherwise, there is an increase in wage inequality in the skill premium. This is the standard view about the mainstream view about wage inequality. What is the problem with this view? The problem with the mainstream view is that basically the idea that education alone, education is the major driver of wage inequality, is inconsistent with empirical evidence. Okay? Because actually educational differences explain only a small fraction of the overall differences in wage inequality, as the literature has found that actually most of the differences in wages are found within groups that have the same educational level. Okay, so other factors matter, factors other than education in explaining wage inequality. Differences across industries. Industries have different trajectories in terms of innovation, productivity, and so on. So they also have different trajectories in terms of wages, family background, and so on. A crucial factor is the evolution of the capital-labor conflict. The context in which the increasing wage inequality has taken place is one of a huge process of income redistribution from labor to capital, with 10–15% of GDP that has shifted wages to profits since the 80s. Okay, so the decline in the labor share and the increase in wage inequality has gone hand in hand. Here you have the trajectory of the labor income share for the 4 countries, Germany, Spain, France, and Italy, for the 4 countries that we are here. And as it is evident, you have a downward trajectory that has been particularly marked for Spain and Italy. A downward trajectory in the labor share implies a decoupling within the trajectory of real wages and labor productivity. So workers have become increasingly less able to capture the productivity gains of the economy. Okay? Real wages have grown less than labor productivity in almost all countries and sectors. What are the main drivers that have been found in the literature of the reduction, the fall in the labor share of income? Basically, among the factors, labor market deregulation, labor-saving technology, and offshoring, with the threat of relocating production abroad that is able to weaken the workers' bargaining power. Okay, and all these factors also implies an increase in wage inequality. Why? Because actually, as it was told before in the first part of this section, of this seminar, the top wage earner receives part of their compensation out of capital income, so a redistribution from wages to profits imply an increase in the wages for the top earners, and also because these factors hit, labor market regulation, labor saving technology, and offshoring hit the low-paid workers more heavily than the other. Okay, so low-skilled workers can be replaced by labor-saving technologies, are more subject to relocation of production abroad in low-wage countries. So there is a close connection between the rising power of capital over labor, with implications in terms of changes in functional income distribution, and the increasing wage inequality. Also, the individualization of economic and social conditions with the fragmentation of the working class along several dimensions, gender, ethnic factors, type of labor market contracts, is a factor of increasing wage inequality that interact with increasing power of capital over labor, because it weakens the ability of workers to counteract the tendency towards increasing power of capital over labor. So we need to move beyond the standard view on neoclassical skill-biased technical change. We need to consider the role of profits. We need to consider that the role of technology is also not unidimensional, but different technological activities may have different effects on wages and employment. So we need to distinguish between technological activities that are complementary to high skills, that are probably lead to an increase in wage inequality, technological activities that are complementary to secondary education, that are probably lead to a reduction in wage inequality. Also, we need to consider that the relationship between wages and labor productivity and innovation in general is not unidirectional, but is a two-way relationship. So productivity and innovation have a positive effect on wages, but also higher wages may have a positive effect on productivity by efficiency wages, or because they can act as an incentive for firms to innovate. The role of labor market dynamics, another crucial factor that explain the dynamics of wage inequality. Again, faster employment growth can have different effects on wage inequality. It can lead to an increase in wage inequality if technical change is skill biased. An increase in labor demand is probably to create more jobs and then higher wages for the high-skilled workers, or on the other side, if there is an effect on via bargaining power, also faster employment growth can lead to wage compression. We need to consider the role of labor market institutions. Stronger labor market institutions are typically associated with lower wage inequality. So, for example, strong unions tend to compress the wage structure, and of course, an increase in the share of workers with non-standard jobs lead to an increase in wage inequality, because non-standard jobs are paid less than traditional permanent and full-time jobs. So the database, as I told, we combined the sectoral innovation database, which in turn is a combination of data from the OECD structural analysis database on profits, total employment, and other variables. Data from the labor force survey on labor market variables, so employment, education, non-standard works, and other variables, and the innovation data from the community innovation survey. And we combine the sectoral innovation database with a structural earning survey that contains data, wage data by occupational groups. So the resulting database is a panel with industry data on manufacturing sectors and service sectors for the 3 years of observation for which we have data, 2010, 2014, and 2018. Countries included are 4: Germany, France, Italy, and Spain. So in the light of the discussion, what are the key variables? The key dependent variables is the ratio, the wage ratio, the ratio of the average annual wage of managers to the average annual wage of manual workers. Then we also looked at the determinants of the wage levels of the 2 occupational groups. So the average annual wage of managers and the average annual wage of manual workers. Are the key explanatory variables: profits per employee and employee, and productivity, the share of innovative firms as a broad measure of innovation, employment, the share of non-standard workers as a measure of labor, and some education variables, tertiary, the share of workers with tertiary and secondary education. And also we add as a control variable the standard deviation of the wages within occupations. They're also a measure of within group wage distribution. Here there is some descriptive evidence. Here on the horizontal axis you have labor productivity. On the vertical axis the three alternative dependent variables. Here you have the wage ratio. Here the wage of managers. Here the wage of manual workers. And as expected, well, this is quite intuitive, there is a positive association between labor productivity and the wage levels of the two groups, but there is no correlation between the wage ratio and labor productivity. So apparently, productivity gains could be well distributed across workers. The picture about the relationship between profits and the three key dependent variables is different. Here we have that there is a positive correlation between profits per employee and the wage level of managers, as expected, while there is no correlation between the level of profits per employee and the wage of manual workers. As a result, an increase in the level of profits per employee is associated to an increase in the wage ratio. Here is the relationship with innovation. Here I have, I was saying, a broad measure of innovation, the share of innovative firms, so the share of firms that perform any kind of innovation, product innovation, process or organizational innovations. As expected, we have that an increase in innovation activity by the firms is associated to an increase in the wage levels of both groups, of both. Here you have the effect of precarization as measured by the share of non-standard workers, so workers with fixed-term contracts or part-time contracts. And as expected, an increase in the share of non-standard workers is associated to a reduction in the wage level of manual workers. And as a result, is associated to an increase in wage inequality. So, the last group of variables is education, and as you can see, positive correlation between the share of workers with tertiary education and wage inequality, while the correlation between the share of workers with secondary education and wage ratio is much lower. So what are the determinants of wage inequality? Profits per employee that are expected to have a positive effect on wage inequality because part of the increase in profits translate into higher compensation for managers. The share of firms performing innovation, so we use a broad measure of technology as a first step. The next step is to distinguish between different innovation activities and between proper innovation activity and the process of diffusion of technology across sectors and firms that is likely to have different effect on the wage structure. Then we have the labor market variables. I consider it alternative the change in the total employment of the sector, so without distinguishing between occupational groups, and also the employment level by occupational groups. Of course, an increase in the employment level of a specific occupational group is expected to have a positive effect on the wage level of that category, of that group, via an increase in bargaining power, while the effect of a change in the total employment is not clear a priori. The share of non-standard workers as a measure of labor market institutions, so the share of workers with fixed-term or part-time jobs, that of course is expected to have a positive effect on wage inequality. Finally, education variables. I used both the share of workers with tertiary education and the share of workers with secondary education. Tertiary education is expected to have a positive effect on wage inequality because it is complementary to product innovation. Secondary education, complementary to technologies across sectors, is expected to have a negative effect on wage inequality. These are simple regression, so this is a very preliminary, these are very preliminary results. In the first regression, in the baseline regression, I have profits per employee as a key variable, the share of innovative firms, the rate of change in employment, in total employment, the share of non-standard workers, and the share of workers with tertiary education. And as expected, profits per employee have a positive effect on the dynamics of wage inequality. Here, the order of magnitude is a 1,000 euro increase in the level of profits per employee increases the wage ratio by 1 percentage point. It's not a strong effect, but it's innovation activity and change in employment have a negative effect on the level of wage inequality. Precarization and share of workers with tertiary education, as expected, have a positive effect. In the second regression, I replaced the change in the employment rate with the specific level of employment, so the employment of managers and the employment of manual workers, and of course, the employment of managers that increase the wage of managers has a positive effect on wage inequality, while the employment level of manual workers has a negative effect. In the third regression, I replaced the share of workers with tertiary education with the share of workers with secondary education. That has a negative effect on wage inequality. And finally, I added as a control variable the standard deviation of within group distribution, within group wage distribution. The effect of this variable is positive, and also all the results of the baseline regression are confirmed. Then I looked at the determinants of the wage levels of the two groups. Again, as expected, the profits per employee have a positive effect on the wage of managers. The share of innovative firms also has a positive effect on wages, because technological upgrading has a positive effect on wages, of course. There is also a positive effect on employment, both in the increase in total labor demand and in the employment level. Tertiary education looks to be not statistically significant, while there is a positive effect on the share of workers with secondary education. What about the determinants of the wage of manual workers? Profits per employee is not statistically significant. Innovation, again, has a positive effect on wages. So basically, a technological upgrading has a positive, expands the cake. So it has a positive effect on both wages, of the wages of both categories, but has a stronger effect on the wages of manual workers. So it has the effect of reducing wage inequality. Employment also has a positive effect. The share of non-standard workers, as expected, measure of labor market precarization, have a negative effect. Tertiary education also has a negative effect. Secondary education has a positive effect. Okay? So, summary of these very preliminary results. The drivers of wage inequality in European industry are profits, so the shift away from wages and towards profit, employment of managers that have a positive effect on the wage of managers via increasing the bargaining power of managers, precarization with a higher share of workers with no standard jobs, tertiary education, inequality within occupational groups, while the forces have had a compression effect on the wage structure are technological upgrading, so higher share of firms doing innovation, a change in total labor demand, the employment level of manual workers, and secondary education. Okay? And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. The final presentation we'll have now Valeria Cirillo, who is an associate professor at the University of Bari, and together with Mario Pianta, represented by Valeria, on wage inequality in Italy. Is there such a thing as wage inequality in Italy?
Yeah, it seems so. Okay, thank you, Guglielmo and Mario, for organizing this meeting today. Our work, which is very preliminary, is titled Wage Inequality in Italy, and is a joint work with Laura Bisio and Matteo Lucchese. Laura Bisio is also online with us, and Mario Pianta. The institutional framework of the work is part of a big project that is actually a laboratorio ISTAT. ISTAT is the National Institute of Statistics for James. The project title, in fact, is Quality of Employment and Wage Inequality, the role of technological change and firm characteristics. And this work is part of this main project, also Chuprin project one. Actually, the Tele project is also the environment in which also this meeting has been organized. Okay, so the main research questions and aim of our work are these three. So we would like to investigate wage polarization, basically identify how inequality stratify across workers, who is populating the top 1% and the bottom 10% of the wage distribution nowadays in Italy. We focus on 2018, just one time, but our idea is to track this over time. And actually trying to disentangle the drivers of wages at the top and the bottom of the wage distribution. As I said, this is a very preliminary exercise and work that we are presenting here. Why? Well, actually, also in the previous session, it has been pointed out that we have realized we have an upsurge in income inequality in most developing countries, as was outlined before by Galbraith, but this is also for Italy. Italy is not an exception. If we focus on the top 10% and top 1%, as also Maurizio was stressing at the beginning, we see that the share of national income going to this part of the distribution is rising very much, has raised very much. So the top 10% has increased its share of national income by about 10 percentage points from 1980 to 2022. And also the top 1% has almost doubled its share of national income in the last 40 years. So inequalities are generated and amplified in the labor market, increasing disparity in market incomes compared to disposable income. So we are focusing on market incomes. And the wages says a lot because it's a very big part of the story, since they account for 75% of household income. So maybe we should focus on what's going on in wages. Which kind of data we are using? We are using the data from the ISTAT, National Institute of Statistics. Basically, we put together two different registers. On the one side, we have the ASIA business registers, which has a lot of information on the employer side. So you have information on firms' characteristics. On the other side, you have information on employees, on workers, and basically we have wages. So this is the population, actually. These are not two samples, but are registers, so archives. The name is RACLI, linked with the employment, ASIA employment register. So basically you have characteristics of workers and gross wages. The RACLI, which is the population we are focusing on in this very brief exercise, we are focusing on people which are in this part of the distribution. So in a sense, the most luckily the fortunate ones. Why? Because we are focusing on full-time, open-ended contracts with salaries above 15,000 euros per year and at least 1,000 paid hours over the year. So we are not focusing on this part of the distribution, which includes, of course, part-time, temporary position, and all this stuff, but we have selected people in this part. In terms of numerosity, if you see the histograms, is the red portion of these curves. In terms of numerosity, here you have some numbers. So we are talking about 7 million job positions, which correspond more or less to 7 million workers, because in this database you have job position and not workers, but obviously if you cut on full-time open-ended at the end, you are talking about workers. So, and we focus, as I said at the beginning, to two different portions of this population, and specifically to the bottom 10%, these people here, and to the people that are here, so the top 1%. Because it's really interesting to understand the dynamics, or at least the drivers of the wages in these two different groups. As I said, if we see the numbers in terms of decile or all job position with respect to only full-time and permanent job position, you see there are very striking differences. In fact, it's shocking that if we see the all job position for 2018, the first decile, actually nowadays in Italy, these are nominal gross wages, is about 600 euros, whereas the people we are talking about have at least, about 20,000 euro per year in the first decile. Then you have more or less 27,000 euro per year at the median. And if we see the top 1%, the people, the workers we are focusing on, we have about 123,000 at the top of the 1% as thresholds. So which are the peoples in these two groups? If we see the characteristics and we focus on the top 1%, we can say that they are mainly men for 86%, Italian 93%, quite old, over 50 years old. They have for 62% tertiary education. They are managers in terms of profession. This is dirigente in Italian, so it's not like a perfect correspondence with the ISCO category, but sort of. So they are manager. They work in the northwest of Italy for the 55%, and they work mainly in the finance sectors, knowledge-intensive financial services, and also, by the way, there is a quite big portion in the less knowledge-intensive market services for about 22%. If we focus on the bottom 10%, so the poorest one, those at the bottom of the distribution, then we see that we have a larger, comparative to the others, 33% are women, 14% extra EU, quite young, 24% are people between 15 and 29 years old. It's quite shocking that in this population, the bottom 10%, we have about 40% of people with a secondary education, and they are at the bottom of the distribution. Also, in this case, we have quite a high proportion of people in the Northwest, 30%, but in the South also we have 20%. Low-tech manufacturing for the 13%, but even in this case, we had a quite high percentage in the less knowledge-intensive market services, 36%. So, services are very much polarized because you have people actually in the bottom 10%, but you have some few also in the top 1%. Wage distributions, well, this is more or less what I said. So this is the histogram. So you see the frequency, but even the distribution in terms of wages, those people at the top 1% and even top 10% are mainly men, male, whereas female women are located in the medium and bottom part of the distribution. In terms of professional groups, this is as expected. You have at the top of the distribution mainly dirigente, which means manager, whereas manual workers, operaio, the pink part, the pink color is mainly on the left side of this distribution. It's quite interesting to see that people classified as clerks, so impiegati, this let's say violet distribution, are mainly both at the bottom and also quite on the right side of this distribution. So it's very widespread. So you can have very different type of working condition within this category as impiegati clerks. In terms of macro region, as expected in the south, you see a more left skewed distribution compared to the northwest. In fact, people in this part seems to be more to be located in terms of workers in the northwest. It's also interesting to notice that the northeast has almost the same median wage of the others of people in the south and center of Italy. Now, this is very preliminary. What we tried also, because running these estimates took a lot of time, so we hope to have more time even in the next meeting to present you more complete results. These are like determinants of belonging to the top 1% and bottom 10% of the distribution. So these are marginal effects, including provincial and sectoral dummies. What we see is that basically the gender effect is very present, because increase the probability to be in the bottom 10%, whereas decrease the probability to be in the top 1%. Age classes, being young, does not favor the inclusion in the top 1%, whereas increase the probability to be quite a poor worker in the bottom 10%. Tertiary education, as expected, increase the probability to be in the top 1% and decrease the probability to be in the bottom 10%. Interesting is the domestic group. It seems that working in a company that can be classified as domestic group decrease the probability to be in the top 1%, and also, as expected, decrease the probability to be in the bottom 10%. Compared to what? Compared to family companies, for instance, or other type of societies. Being and working in a foreign company increase the probability to be in the top 1%. So if you work in a foreign company, multinational foreign company, so maybe you have the chance to be in the top 1%. Compared, for example, Italian multinational, where this is not significant in terms of coefficients. Also, I mean, it is quite interesting, the coefficient in terms of size. While, I mean, the sign is negative for the bottom 10%, meaning that if you work in a large company, the probability to be in the bottom 10% decrease. If you work in a large company, this maybe does not increase the probability to work in the top 1%. Why? Because here we are controlling for the provincial and the sector effects. And so it is possible that once we clean for the sectoral and the geographical composition, so then the story of the size does not tell a lot, the size of the company. Then we focus also in terms of drivers or wages within these groups. So we split the population in the two groups, top 1%. In fact, you see the number of observations is very different. And we try to see if there are differences in the terms of coefficients, but mainly if there are like drivers within this specific group. And also we did the same exercise, applying a conditional quantile regressions. Here, more or less, the coefficients are as expected, splitting also for manufacturing and services. Mainly, the expected sign are confirmed. I forgot to say that also we control for the level of productivity of the company. Highly productive means if you work in a company that belongs to the 10% most productive company of the country in that year. So working in a highly productive companies increase the probability, pushes in up, increases the wage or seem to be associated to an higher wage in the bottom 10%, but also this is true to the top 1%. The story of the size is quite interesting that it works for manufacturing in the sense that if you work in a larger company, you have a higher wage if you are in the bottom 10%, but also in the top 1%. But when we see the same in services, well, in that case, as I was highlighting before, this increase the wages for those being in the bottom 10%, but as I said, it's not associated to a wage premium for the top 1%. This is very much a story maybe of the finance services, because here we are focusing only on the services sector. Mario, if you want to, okay, I conclude saying that, well, this is just a summary of results and very preliminary work. Top 1% of employees, they are the majority male, 90% managers in terms of professions, all junior managers. Junior managers is like a quite bad translation, but of quadri in Italian. In medium tech manufacturing and knowledge-intensive services, finance play a huge role, as we were saying before, mostly located in Northwest, and we also had the chance to focus in which provinces, and the majority of these people are concentrated in Milan, actually, very few in Bari, I have to say. But this is a very much a story of the north of Italy, and a specific part of the north, which is the northwest, not the northeast. And their wages are driven by university education, work in the top 10% of most productive firms, of course, working firms which are part of Italian but more foreign groups, both manufacturing and services. What is at the bottom, we see that there is male, even male, but also young people. 15%, as I said, are extra EU. This is quite shocking, as I said, the huge part as a secondary education in terms of title of education. Consider that here we are focusing on the privileged part of the workers, because these are people having full-time, permanent position and working quite a lot over the year. So these are not working poor. And in this case, seniority plays a role, because if these people have a high level of seniority, I don't display the coefficient, but we control for the level of seniority, so how much time you spend in the same company over time. And well, they work in Northwest as well, although we saw that 20% are also located in the South. Next step, we will try to match also, to link, yes, this with the permanent census of enterprise, where we have information concerning the innovation strategies of companies, as well as the level of internationalization and so on, to explain a little bit more, to put inside the story, the role of technology, industries, and so on. Well, that's all, and thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Valeria. That was very, very also nice to look at. Although you lost me a little bit when you put the white colors in blue and the blue colors in pink, and it's probably we are deconstructing, let's say, the colors of the occupational groups. Now we have a couple of discussants. A few discussants. I would like to ask Massimo Aprea, who is a researcher at Sapienza University, to come first.
So first of all, I would like to thank all the speakers for the very interesting presentations. So I would go more or less with some basic points and maybe some questions. First of all, Michele Raitano's presentation, which of course highlights, I think one of the main points is the importance of understanding that to study the effects of something like inflation on well-being, some measures of well-being may be insufficient, and what Michele was saying about the disposable household income as an insufficient statistic that gives you a kind of flat evolution of inequality and poverty, of course, is very important. And of course, the step forward also in framing the theoretical part is, in my opinion, managing to distinguish between what depends on basic needs and what depends on preferences. So this was just something on the first presentation. Now, for what concerns the second one by Marco Stamegna, of course, we are switching to something different, and I found the presentation really interesting. I would like to have I have some questions about the sectoral, the role played by sector. So basically, you are looking at the difference between the ratio between compensation of managers versus manual workers. And I think you have the data because you have 18 manufacturing, 23 services sectors. How does this ratio change across these sectors? Because also linking myself to the presentation by Valeria Cirillo, of course, services sectors seem to play a role also in explaining the drivers of top and bottom wages, and also what happens to these ratios if you do not take the average of managers versus manual workers, but you, for instance, take other parts of distribution. I would expect, for instance, that the top 90th percentile of managers could grow even more, could be in a panel perspective, could grow even more compared, for instance, to the average of, or to the median of manual workers, or you could also look at something in between. Yes, finally, on the final presentation by Valeria Cirillo, I was wondering one thing. So basically, you are excluding a wide set of let's say, the poorest workers. And I was wondering if, in analyzing the polarization of wage polarization, the drivers of that part of the labor force, of the wages of that part of the labor force are different. And of course, you spoke about the role of labor market institutions. And for instance, what about, I'm thinking that contractual arrangements, all these, we are excluding all the non-full-time employees. Maybe all those other atypical contracts play a big role. And that's all for me. Thank you again, and I leave to the other discussants.
Okay, thank you. Now the next one is Elena Reglic of Sapienza University, Rome.
So I'd also like to thank to all the speakers and also to Mario for inviting me today. I will start with the presentation of Raitano. At the beginning, when you were mentioning that there are two channels how the inflation can impact the inequalities, and you mentioned within and between goods. I would also add another one that actually Professor Galbraith mentioned today is the effect of the increase in interest rates that the central banks did to fight that inflation. So that's also another channel. Just to mention, of course, you cannot access this in your work. Okay. There's one thing that I didn't really understand. So you're using 2019 where you have only information on the food, right? And the private transport, but that's like irrelevant. So you don't have at all information housing, because looking at the data that you've shown, the inflation was like much higher for housing. So the situation that you showed us would be even worse, considering the housing part, which is also basic good, as you outlined during your presentation. And last point, you also show that when you index wages, the Gini goes up, right? Probably it will go a little bit less up if you just index the minimum wage. But, of course, in countries that have one. Then, moving to Marco's presentation. I mean, we already spoke about this. I suggested using a measure of inequality as an additional or robustness check, for instance, standard deviation, considering all wages of all occupations within industry. Also, I think that you're missing some controls, for instance, on socio-demographic characteristics that you could add. I guess that results wouldn't change much. And adding some heterogeneity analysis, for instance, by public classes, will be bad. And coming to the last paper, one question. As also Massimo pointed out, so you're keeping basically those that are the luckiest one. However, I've noticed that the job position are still higher than the number of workers. And I was a little bit marginally, but how is it possible to be? Okay, so it's that. While they are, of course, representative of the top, they are probably way less representative of the, but representative of the bottom. So when you're focusing on those that are the luckiest one, and then you're looking at the drivers of the bottom 10, they're not really the bottom 10. So you're a bit underestimating. I mean, yeah. Yeah, but my point is that, I mean, my point is just that it's not really the bottom 10. Right, just that. I mean, why you have? No, but anyway, I mean, why you have chosen to, I mean, consider only those workers? That's my question. Then I can reformulate it. Also, having such a rich data, I think that you should also try to look at the stratification using different dimensions. So not just gender, nationality, age, and so on, but like looking at the different dimensions together. In that table on descriptives, where you have the top 1% and bottom 10, I would also add additional column that basically, let's say, gives information on the labor force, so of the total population of the labor force. So when you say that 15% of the bottom 10 are foreigners, I mean, in the total labor force, they're much less. So it's even, I mean, more important results. So just to interpret. I'm smiling because I did. No. I would just add this, let's say, the statistics for the whole labor force. And yeah, I mean, it's a preliminary work, so I mean, I have a lot of suggestions for heterogeneity analysis, but yeah, we can also speak about it later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlo. Riccardo Rinaldi, Università di Parma, researcher at University of... Oh.
So I repeat the thankings to everybody. So I think that all contributions today were very consistent with each other. They are all sort of works that aim to refine measurements of inequality today, as the title of the seminar today. But as also Michele Raitano was saying, this kind of refinement of measurement is necessary. Of course, inequality is widely discussed, but as he was mentioning, not all institutions acknowledge that. So, of course, all the works presented today, they really go into that also in different ways, analyzing different dimensions. But I would say that altogether they present a very broad, complex, but deeper understanding of this issue that, of course, our society is living in. So, of course, the first step, measurements of inequality is important. The other aspects that we already discussed and that in some works now we saw a bit more into that are the drivers, of course, of that. And that's like, I would say, the next step that we all should take in order to better understand so why there are these inequalities. And we saw something in the work both of Marco Stamegna and Valeria Cirillo. There are a lot of dimensions, again, and different possible drivers. But one thing, maybe because I also come from political sciences, is a bit more stress on that. Of course, we see clearly what are the kind of economical causes that in general we can summarize as capitalist has more bargaining power right now than the labor class. But of course, we are living in institutions. And so what is the role of this institution in accelerating, trying to decelerate, trying to reduce inequalities? Also about that, Professor Galbraith already mentioned something. Movement of capital, of course, probably the role of a European Union. And I think that we should also look into that. Just a couple of issues about the presentation. We already entered a lot into them. About presentation of Michele Raitano, I think that, so of course, this is a hot topic right now, inflation. Of course, again, this is an attempt to better measure that. Already the study on the data of the share of expenditures on food is very interesting, and of course the other steps about how inflation, of course, is different between goods. as Jelena was saying, I would look into that, the issue of housing and energy, even if you already said that you don't have data about transportation. I'm asking about light, gas, so housing bills, also nothing. Okay, so we look for this data into other data sets. And about the work of Marco and Valeria, again, one thing that struck me today is the role of managers, of course. This is an important issue. This is probably, as we were discussing before, not very studied, but of course we mentioned them a lot today. So probably it's something that we should look into more. Marco, of course, we are working together, so this is just a note also for myself, but we put managers together with professionals and technicians, but because of their role, which is peculiar, we could also try to think to disentangle them. And so, more in general, I would ask also to Valeria, considering also the issue you mentioned about the firm size, so how we can consider also managers of small firms, also in an analysis of class relations. Should we consider, this is a question for everybody, should we consider managers of small firms, example in Italy, we know, as small capitalists, or do they have a different role in the value chain? So thank you, everybody, again.
Thank you very much, Riccardo. Thank you, so everybody. Now, we have already collected a few questions, but there is time for more. And I see 3 hands on this side and 2 on the other side. Yeah, 3, 2. This side wins. Now, let's see. Let's go this side and then here. Yeah, 1, 2, 3.
Just a couple of questions to Valeria and Marco. The first to Marco, that is an important issue because if I well understood, you are considering only annual incomes, annual earnings from that point of view, while the difference between, at least for Italy, is in a recent paper I noticed, the difference between managers and manual work and manual workers is due to working hours. So what does it change if you take full-time equivalent hourly wages to understand the mechanism, the mediating factor? Because, for instance, in the relationship between innovation and inequality, according to your measure, it may happen that firms who innovate more are firms who take more atypical contracts because of characteristics of the job and so on. And so there is something that you should try to go more in detail. To Valeria, a suggestion and a couple of considerations. First of all, as I told you already this morning on the train, be very careful because your data came from INPS. INPS data do not take into account bonuses. If you want to look at the bottom, the upper part of the distribution, be careful that you have information on the part over the maximal amount of redistribution for pensions. Because in Italy, those who are in the NDC, in the contributivo system, do not pay contributions over more or less 100,000 euros per year. And so you need to check whether these variables is added in your data set. In INPS, in Yemen's data, you have 2 different variables that have to be summed. Otherwise, you have a paradoxical effect because you will have a reduction because there is a cohort effect in this variable, because this variable now is for those more or less biases values for those aged 50 and not for the elderly because they're in the old system. Another suggestion always with this type of data I already made to Laura and other data, always try to be clear about what is the advantage with respect to the bulk of papers on busy teams. Because this is an main point, because this is a suggestion being given in a draft. They have firms. They are full of data on firms' effect on the advantage is that you add the information on the characteristics of the firms. That this is really important. For the empirical part, I suggest you using a UQR analysis only instead of making that you due to step of difference, also because it is difficult to interpret the results. What does it mean that you increase the probability by 3%, by 3 percentage points, not percent, on an event that is 1% by definition? So it means that manager has a 4%. So it is simpler that you go along the whole distribution. If you run many hours, it is possible to observe all the variables. If there is an impressive peak, for instance, that 99% of the distribution is the same, and you have polarization of the characteristic at the bottom and the top. So exploiting all the richness of your data might be useful from that point of view.
I have a question for Marco, just because it's like very close to some of my previous findings, which are reassuring that the main drivers are kind of similar. But I'm a bit puzzled because, I mean, you presented the results, but I didn't see, for example, the evolution of the occupational codes, neither for the industries. I mean, for example, I could observe like an upgrading or a downgrading in the occupations and as well in the sectors. I mean, I could see, for example, that sectors, low value-added sector may increase over time. And since you have a panel, this may be, of course, to be explored. Also, for example, in the spirit of the authors, superstar results where the labor share is decreasing because of the increase of this kind of superstar firms. So what I was expecting is like this kind of shift share analysis or a variance decomposition of wages between and within industries to clearly see what is driving the changes in wages over time, and then just dip within the regressions and see what are the coefficients, for example.
Thank you, everyone. And first of all, I have to say that I just listened to the last presentation, so I have just a comment for Mario and Valeria. Yeah? Yeah. Yeah. And the first note is actually that seeing the graph and realizing that your scholarship, at least in full-time employment, is the first 10%, then there's contribution is interesting. But that said, you have individual data, no? And which can be matched with industry. And I wonder whether you can run a multi-level model instead of a single-level model, not just because it's more correct, no? Because although this won't have a big effect because you have tons of observations, but especially because this would allow you to explore variance of how similar individuals in different firms perform in terms of wages, especially because you look at inequality, and especially probably in the 1%, this would be relevant. And as you want to match with firms with information on innovation or different qualities of the firm, this could be very interesting, no? So yeah, that's the thing.
The mic.
Working?
Is there a mic that can get also to men keeping the voice only to themselves and not around?
Thank you very much. I have two questions for Marco. Have you been able to measure the role of the fall in the unionization rate and the rise in the unemployment rate as explanations? It's the first question. And the second is, have you compared these trends in different sectors and taken these differences into account? For example, the oil sector and the health sector, because this is very different. For all the presentators, for everyone, and Valeria, have you taken into account the difference between the public and the private sector? And for Valeria, in the last slide, where are the women? There is only men in the 1% and men in the 10 of the bottom.
I have a question for Michele. So no, I mean, you say one of the limits is that with this methodology we cannot consider the heterogeneity in wage indexation and contractual renewals. So what about doing the same stuff but maybe disaggregating by professional category? Because at least in Italy, you know, this was very relevant. So maybe if you can select or doing the same by group, at least you can clean about this issue that in Italy actually is very and a relevant part of the story.
No, good. No. Now, given that the presenters have taken the time of the question from the floor, they have forfeited their rights to answer. You know, because the share of time is the amount of time is fixed. We can't increase the cake. Unless it is one word, because many questions were quite technical contribution. You know, why not running in this kind of model rather than the other model, increasing the data and so on. I think it's very good that there were these questions, suggestions that will be taken on and so on, but there isn't a huge amount of utility in in discussing it further. I would like to make two very quick comments. One was going back to what James said this morning, but they came back a few times. The global inequality curve, especially measured by you, but other ways also point at something similar. Over time, it's linked to neoliberalism or whatever we call it. So it was going down in the good old days, and then 1980, or Ronald Reagan and all the other people like that, boom, we're going up for good 20 years. And then 9/11, China going up, and the financial crisis and so on, it becomes bubbling. It's a bit more complex to see. And you say, that's very interesting, but in a way, it raises two questions. One is about the world. How do we call the system, let's say, in the last 20 years? Is it still neoliberal in the same way? Is it not? How do we combine the still increasing inequality within countries, we had example from Italy and so on, with the fact that global inequality is falling because all the industrializing countries, China and so on and so forth, are going up? How do we combine that? How do we call it this last 20 years? Is it still neoliberal? Is it the same as the 80s and 90s or not, and so on? The other one is a problem about us. That is economists, but also sociologists. How does it come that in the 20 years, when inequality was growing so fast and so much, nobody cared? I mean, it was not a topic. I was too young, so I'm not guilty. But I mean, nobody cared. Nobody studied it. Nobody talked about it. Social classes were dead. Inequality was dead, and so on and so forth. And now that inequality is a bit flattening in some measures of global inequality is going down, we are all worried about the 1%, the 99%. Do we always have to come 20 years later? I mean, cannot we be a little bit faster in analyzing and understanding what the world is and try to what is going on, for instance, now? What is about to arrive? Are we going to see these Ronaldo factors everywhere or not? I really like to push everybody to think about the trend, where we are going, not only what happened, and certainly not theorizing only 20 years later. The second point, and I'm grateful to Dominique, but also, I mean, it was mentioned here and there implicitly, the capital, labor, power relations as a factor and so on. But, thank you, Dominique, you mentioned trade unions, because I was thinking, well, I give up. My job is totally useless as an industrial relations labor sociologist. I mean, collective bargaining, that doesn't matter at all. It was nearly never a variable in all these huge, regressions and models and so on about where inequality is. So is it because it doesn't matter anymore? Is it because we already know it, so what's the point? We gave up on that. And there is nothing we can do anymore. Because, seen from my point of view, there are a couple of important points. One is the coverage of collective bargaining has fallen in many countries. The other one is the level of collective bargaining, I would say even more important, has changed. And company-level collective bargaining, which has been promoted, does very little about these things, whereas the sector-level bargaining has gone down. And the other one is the composition. That is, the collective bargaining that has remained is largely the public sector, people like us who are not at the bottom, and sectors which are still reasonably good. At that point, if that is, can it still be revived? Can it not be revived? Collective bargaining? Do we need to do other things? Should the state get in with minimum wages? But minimum wages, for instance, in Italy, will not be enough because there is the poor poverty. So there are quite a lot of issues that to be. I hope there will be, discussed and studied and included in the analysis more. And then on the permanent, on this the very nice, small discussion about, well, the bottom 10% of the top 50% is not the bottom. What are these permanent workers? In Italy, I mean, this is a very also practical question, I think. Whether should we look only at permanent employment or not? Because I know that for the Tridico, Pasquale Tridico is not here today, but we'll invite him another time to discuss these things because he's busy with other things, but fine. In his proposals for a minimum wage, he looks, he makes his calculation 60%, 50%, and so on. He looks only at permanent employment, which, I understand. Like it comes up as a higher wage. I'm always happy, with a higher wage and a lower wages. But in a way, what is the conceptual and theoretical reason to say that our reference should only be permanent employment? Why we know that there is a lot of people who are not in permanent employment are much poorer is because we want basically to eliminate that kind of work. Is that the problem? Which is fine. Let's focus on that. And by the way, there are also referenda for the CGL sign and so on to reduce precarious work and so on. But I think this is so big now, the share of workers who are not in permanent employment. Are they normal or are they not normal? In a way that is there a conceptual issue and a political issue there, which links, by the way, to seniority, because the fact that seniority, which actually came up in your presentation, the fact that seniority obviously contributes to wage inequality, that is obviously that is only for people who are who are at work for a long time, and it has a huge gender effect. I mean, it's one of the typical cases of indirect gender discrimination, having high seniority pay. In Italy, I mean, it's not as bad as in Germany, but still we have a high share of seniority pay, and which we understand seniority is a good saying. It helps, maybe. If, there is a lot of discourse about job tenure in Italy being long and this being a bad thing because we are rigid or whatever that means. Apart from the fact that it's not proven. But even if that were the case, an issue to be concerned about, why don't we try to increase mobility in a good way by decreasing the weight of seniority pay, not by reducing pay in total, but the weight of seniority pay within pay, whereas we reduce the unwanted, let's say, flexibility, precariousness, which happens with precarious contracts and so on and so forth. Well, I did my preaching, but I'm not standing for election, so I'm not turning into a electoral campaign. James, do you want to add something more, or any? We exploit you a little bit more if you
make a few comments along some of the lines that you were just discussing. The first question you raised was, why is the interest in this so late and so little? Now, in the post-war period, the subject was practically off the table. And by the time I came along in the 1970s, the professors from that period would say, just like watching the grass grow, there's nothing going on in the study of inequality, which of course for me was a tell. Is okay, that's something I should perhaps start paying attention to because it's almost surely wrong. And by the in the middle 1970s, it was clear, if you were looking carefully, that things were in fact beginning to change. But then, beginning I think in the late 80s, early 1990s, the neoclassical mainstream came up with a story And the story was, a really benign story about the functioning of labor markets. Technology was changing and it was rewarding all of you for acquiring computer skills. Right? And if you believe that story, well, that's a story which says the only way to mitigate the problem is to give everybody computer skills. Good luck. I mean, this was, of course, a piece of nonsense, but it became the dominant narrative for a very long period of time. And it's still essentially the dominant narrative. It's still actually what you're expected to look at, is the characteristics of workers and so forth, and not the jobs that are available to them or what they pay, or the structure of the economy in which they're operating. But it's the structure of the economy in which they're operating that's driving the inequalities that we can actually measure, so far as I can tell. And what's going on there? What's going on there is a diminution in the weight of the working class. I mean, the manufacturing class. So that shows up very clearly in our estimates of inequality. This is a very important variable. And as that number goes down, inequality goes up. Why? Because without that core of a middle class labor force which has bargaining power in the manufacturing sector, societies, the whole institutions of social democracy get weakened, as well as the wage structures get weakened. And what did you end up with? You end up in the United States in the last 40 years, there hasn't been a single net job created in manufacturing, not one. In the last few years, there've been a little tiny bit. But all the jobs have been in the services sector, and they've all been paid at the services rate, which is maybe half of what a manufacturing worker in an establishment, or less than half. And that's what everybody's making, except for a few people who are in the finance and information technology sector in a few ghettos, one of which I happen to live in, which is Central Texas. But it's a secondary ghetto. The primary ones are California and New York. And those people are, of course, in a different world, in a totally different world. And their incomes, as has already been noted, come largely from capital, one way or another from capital assets. It's either from the appreciation of stock that they're paid, or it's venture capital, which is just being paid by investors who are taking their capital gains and dumping it into a particular class of worker in order to amplify their gains in the future. And that's the economy in which we live. And that's, of course, an economy which is dominated by a handful of oligarchs whose names we know. It's not different from Russia or Ukraine, or, it's the same thing. They may be a little bit more genteel in their presentation and maybe also in Europe. But essentially it's the same phenomenon. It's a very, very highly stratified class structure. I'll give you a little story about politics in the U.S., if you don't mind, because how this plays into the structure of American elections is very interesting. I did an article for Structural Change and Economic Dynamics on this. Oh, you have two parties, Democrats and Republicans. The Democrats have become a party of the two tails of the distribution. So if you're an urban professional, you're likely to be a Democrat. And if you are a low-income minority, black, brown, Native American, you're likely to be a Democrat by overwhelming margins. In the states where those two tails are fat, those states are Democratic. In all the states which are suburban, rural, small towns, those are largely white, often working-class Republican states. And so as inequality has increased in the United States, state by state, states have gone from the Republican to the Democratic column, systematically. California, New York, Massachusetts, New Jersey, recently Nevada, Arizona. The Democratic Party has become the party of increased inequality because that's where its votes are, on the two tails. The Republican Party is the opposite. That's not to say that their policies promote inequality or equality, but this is how the politics of the country has impacted. We did a calculation of this between 1990 and 2014, the 14 states where the inequality had increased the most, all of them voted for Hillary Clinton. States where it had increased less predominantly voted for Donald Trump. see that phenomenon continuing to develop in the structure of American politics.
So the only thing we can, so the Democrats, it will be in their interest to increase inequality to stay in power. The only our hope is that the Republicans will be so clever they will reduce inequality to stay in power. I don't know.
I tell my Republican friends that they'd better preserve the New Deal institutions if they want to have a chance of survival. But it is very clear. It's very clear from the Clinton era, Obama era phenomenon that the Democrats are funded by Wall Street and they rely on low-income minorities to flesh out a majority in important states.
A paradox. In Italy, there are some little similarities a little bit, but only to some extent with that. Although I was reading recently that the support for the Democrats among ethnic minorities is falling very sharply among the young generations. The young blacks and young Latinos
no, it is true.
Don't support Democrats anymore.
In 2020, the only demographic group where Donald Trump lost ground was white men. Every other black, brown, female, he gained ground. And he may still be, who knows what's going on now, but you know, we'll see this played out. Thank you. I've seen this movie already too many times. I mean, it's not Casablanca. It's not fun to watch, but we'll see how it plays out one more time. Yeah.
Mario, you want to say something? No? Anybody want to say the last word about inequality? Speak now or never again? I'm the chair, so with only 15 minutes delay, I declare this fantastic workshop closed. Thank you very much. Hope to see you again in the future.